The precise year of Charles's birth remains one of history's minor mysteries, with contemporary sources placing it somewhere between 747 and 748 AD. What stands beyond dispute is that he entered the world at the apex of Carolingian power, born into a dynasty that had already begun reshaping the political landscape of Western Europe. His father, Pepin the Short, had recently orchestrated one of the most audacious political coups in medieval history, deposing the last Merovingian king Childeric III and claiming the Frankish throne with papal blessing in 751 AD. This revolutionary act established a new precedent. Kingship legitimized not merely by blood or conquest, but by divine sanction channeled through the Church of Rome. The Frankish court into which Charles was born bore little resemblance to the sedentary palace complexes of later medieval kingdoms. The Carolingian court remained fundamentally itinerant, moving seasonally between royal estates scattered across the realm. The young Charles would have experienced childhood as a constant journey through the forest and river valleys of Francia, from the Rhine frontier to the Atlantic coast, absorbing the rhythms of royal governance that demanded the king's physical presence to maintain authority. These early travels exposed him to the remarkable diversity of his father's domains, from the Romanized territories of Aquitaine to the Germanic heartlands along the Rhine, each region maintaining distinct legal traditions, languages, and cultural practices that would later challenge his imperial ambitions. The political landscape of 8th century Francia reflected the ongoing tension between centralization and fragmentation that characterized early medieval Europe. The Carolingian rise to power had not eliminated the entrenched nobility that had dominated Frankish politics for centuries. Instead, Pepin the Short's reign required constant negotiation with powerful magnates who controlled vast estates and commanded personal armies. These aristocrats, many descended from the old Merovingian court, viewed the new dynasty with varying degrees of acceptance and suspicion. Young Charles observed his father navigating these treacherous political waters, learning that royal authority depended as much on personal relationships and strategic marriages as on military might. The Carolingian court itself functioned as both a centre of governance and a military headquarters. The palace complex, wherever it might be temporarily established, buzzed with the constant activity of scribes copying royal diplomas, messengers arriving with reports from distant frontiers, and nobles seeking audiences with the king. Charles grew up surrounded by the apparatus of early medieval statecraft, the chancery that produced royal documents, the treasury that managed the kingdom's resources, and the chapel that provided spiritual guidance and maintained diplomatic correspondence with Rome and Constantinople. This environment provided an intensive education in the practical mechanics of rule that no formal curriculum could match. Pepin the Short recognised early that his son's education must encompass both the traditional martial skills expected of Frankish nobility and the more sophisticated administrative capabilities required to govern a complex realm. The king arranged for Charles to receive instruction from some of the most learned men available in 8th century Francia, including clerics trained in the cathedral schools that preserved classical learning and maintained diplomatic correspondence with foreign courts. These tutors introduced the young prince to Latin literature, Christian theology, and the rudiments of law and administration. However, this intellectual training never overshadowed the paramount importance of military preparation. Frankish military culture demanded that noble youth demonstrate their courage and skill in actual combat, rather than merely training exercises. Charles received his first exposure to warfare during his father's campaigns against the Saxons, Aquitanians, and other peoples who challenged Carolingian authority. These expeditions provided practical instruction in the logistics of medieval warfare, the complex process of assembling armies from across the kingdom, maintaining supply lines through hostile territory, and coordinating cavalry and infantry forces in battle. The young prince learned to read terrain, assess enemy positions, and understand the psychological factors that often determined victory or defeat before weapons were drawn. The military education Charles received reflected the revolutionary changes occurring in Frankish warfare during the mid-8th century. His grandfather, Charles Martel, had pioneered the use of heavy cavalry that would later become synonymous with medieval military power. Pepin the Short continued these innovations, developing new techniques for siege warfare and expanding the kingdom's capacity to project force across greater distances. Charles absorbed these tactical developments while also learning the diplomatic and logistical skills necessary to maintain the alliances that made large-scale campaigns possible. The Frankish military system depended on the cooperation of numerous independent magnates, each contributing troops and resources in exchange for recognition of their local authority. Christian doctrine formed another crucial component of Charles's education, though his religious instruction differed markedly from the contemplative spirituality practiced in monasteries. The Christianity taught to Carolingian royalty emphasized the king's role as God's representative on earth, responsible for protecting the church and expanding Christian influence among pagan peoples. This militant Christianity justified warfare against non-believers while demanding that Christian rulers maintain high moral standards in their personal conduct. Charles learned to view himself as a warrior king in the tradition of Old Testament monarchs, chosen by divine providence to defend and expand the faith. The papal alliance that legitimized Carolingian rule required constant attention to ecclesiastical politics and theological disputes. Charles observed his father's careful management of relationships with bishops, abbots, and papal legates, learning that religious authority could serve as both a source of legitimacy and a constraint on royal power. The young prince witnessed firsthand how theological debates could have profound political implications, as when disputes over iconoclasm strained relations between the Frankish court and the Byzantine Empire. These experiences taught him that successful kingship required sophisticated understanding of religious doctrine and ecclesiastical law. Pepin the Short's death in 768 AD precipitated a succession crisis that would test everything Charles had learned during his formative years. Following Frankish tradition, the kingdom was divided between Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne, with each receiving roughly equal territories. This division reflected the persistent Frankish belief that royal patrimony should be shared among legitimate male heirs, but it also created the potential for fraternal conflict that had plagued the Merovingian dynasty. Charles received the northern and western portions of the realm, including Neustria and parts of Austrasia, while Charlemagne inherited the southeastern territories, including Burgundy and portions of Aquitaine. The territorial division created immediate practical challenges that revealed the artificial nature of splitting the Carolingian realm. Trade routes, military alliances, and administrative systems that had developed under unified rule now crossed the new boundaries between the brothers' kingdoms. Neither Charles nor Charlemagne possessed sufficient resources to maintain the level of military activity that had characterized their father's reign, yet both faced external threats that demanded coordinated responses. The Lombards continued their expansion in Italy, threatening papal territories and challenging Carolingian interests south of the Alps. Saxon tribes along the northeastern frontier launched renewed raids into Frankish territory, testing the new ruler's resolve and military capabilities. Contemporary sources, though limited, provide intriguing glimpses of Charles's character and ambitions during these early years of independent rule. The Royal Frankish Annals, compiled later but drawing on contemporary records, describe him as exceptionally tall and physically imposing, with a commanding presence that impressed both allies and enemies. Einhard's later biography, while written with the benefit of hindsight, suggests that, even as a young king, Charles displayed the intellectual curiosity and administrative attention to detail that would characterize his later achievements. He reportedly spent considerable time studying legal documents and consulting with advisors about the most effective methods of governing his diverse territories. The relationship between the two brothers remained cordial but increasingly strained as each sought to establish his independent authority. Charles demonstrated early signs of the ambitious vision that would later drive his imperial conquests, undertaking military campaigns and diplomatic initiatives that suggested he viewed his portion of the inheritance as merely the foundation for greater achievements. His court began attracting scholars, warriors and administrators who sensed opportunity in serving a young king with obvious potential for expansion. Meanwhile, Charlemagne appeared more content with consolidating control over his existing territories, focusing on internal administration rather than external conquest. The political dynamics of divided rule created opportunities for various factions within the Frankish nobility to play the brothers against each other. Some magnates who had opposed aspects of Pepin's policies saw the succession as a chance to reassert their independence, while others recognised that the division weakened Carolingian authority and threatened the stability that had benefited their own interests. Charles proved particularly adept at managing these competing pressures, using a combination of personal charisma, strategic generosity, and carefully calculated displays of force to maintain the loyalty of key supporters. External observers, including papal officials and Byzantine diplomats, watched the Frankish succession with keen interest, recognising that the division might alter the balance of power throughout Western Europe. The papal court, which had relied heavily on Carolingian protection against Lombard expansion, found itself in the delicate position of maintaining relationships with both brothers while hoping to preserve the unified support that Pepin had provided. Charles's early diplomatic initiatives suggested that he understood these broader implications and was already positioning himself as the primary Carolingian representative in international affairs. The young king's administrative innovations during this period revealed the influence of his educational experiences and his acute awareness of the challenges facing divided rule. He began experimenting with new methods of communication between distant parts of his kingdom, improving the efficiency of royal messengers and establishing more systematic procedures for collecting information about local conditions. These reforms, though modest in scope, demonstrated his recognition that effective governance required reliable information and rapid response to emerging problems. Military preparations occupied much of Charles's attention during these early years of independent rule, as he recognised that his authority ultimately depended on his ability to project force effectively throughout his territories and beyond. He continued his father's policies of encouraging military innovation, while also working to maintain the complex network of alliances that enabled large-scale campaigns. The young king's personal participation in training exercises and military planning sessions reinforced his reputation as a warrior leader in the traditional Frankish mould, while his attention to logistical details revealed the more sophisticated approach to warfare that would characterise his later conquests. The delicate balance of divided Frankish rule shattered abruptly on December 4th, 771 AD, when Charlemagne died unexpectedly at his villa in Samoussy. The exact cause of his death remains unclear in contemporary sources, though the royal Frankish annals simply record that he fell ill and died within days, leaving behind a young widow, Gerberga, and 2 infant sons who represented potential claimants to his territories. The timing could hardly have been more fortuitous for Charles, who'd spent the previous 3 years chafing under the constraints of shared authority and watching his brother's more cautious approach to governance limit opportunities for expansion. Charles's response to his brother's death demonstrated the calculated decisiveness that would characterise his entire reign. Rather than respecting the traditional Frankish principle that royal inheritance should pass to legitimate male heirs, regardless of age, he moved swiftly to consolidate control over Charlemagne's territories before any organised opposition could emerge. Within weeks of receiving news of his brother's death, Charles had dispatched trusted agents throughout the southeastern kingdoms, securing the loyalty of key administrators and military commanders through a combination of personal appeals, material incentives, and carefully implied threats about the consequences of resistance. The speed of Charles's annexation caught even experienced political observers off guard. Gerberga, recognising that her infant sons stood little chance against their uncle's overwhelming military superiority, fled with her children to the Lombard court of King Desiderius, seeking protection and hoping to preserve some claim to their inheritance. This decision would have profound consequences for subsequent events, as it provided Charles's enemies with potential alternative claimants to Frankish territories, while simultaneously drawing him into the complex web of Italian politics that had frustrated his predecessors. The consolidation of Carloman's territories required more than military occupation. It demanded the delicate work of integrating administrative systems, reconciling competing noble factions, and maintaining the loyalty of populations that had grown accustomed to different policies and personalities. Charles approached these challenges with characteristic energy, conducting an extensive tour of his newly acquired domains that served simultaneously as a display of royal authority and an opportunity to assess local conditions firsthand. His court scribes worked overtime, producing diplomas that confirmed existing land grants and privileges, while subtly asserting Charles's ultimate authority over all aspects of governance. The magnates who had served Carloman faced particularly difficult choices in the aftermath of the succession. Those who had opposed aspects of Charles's more aggressive policies during the period of divided rule now found themselves at the mercy of a king who controlled the entire Frankish realm and possessed both the means and apparent inclination to punish disloyalty. Charles demonstrated considerable political sophistication in handling these potentially dangerous situations, offering generous terms to former opponents who submitted promptly while making examples of those who hesitated or showed signs of continued resistance. The papal court watched these developments with growing concern, recognizing that the elimination of Carloman removed an important moderating influence on Carolingian policy. Pope Stephen III had maintained cordial relations with both brothers, but he understood that Charles's more ambitious temperament might lead to complications in the delicate balance between Frankish protection of papal interests and respect for ecclesiastical independence. The Pope's concerns proved prescient when Charles began pursuing marriage negotiations that threatened to upset the careful diplomatic arrangements that had maintained relative stability in Italian affairs. Charles's decision to seek a Lombard bride represented a dramatic departure from traditional Carolingian policy toward Italy. His father, Pepin the Short, had twice crossed the Alps to protect papal territories from Lombard expansion, establishing the Carolingian dynasty as the primary secular defender of papal independence. The proposed marriage alliance with Desiderata, daughter of King Desiderius, suggested that Charles might be willing to abandon this protective role in exchange for Lombard support for his broader territorial ambitions. The negotiations, conducted through intermediaries during 770 AD, reflected the complex calculations that governed early medieval diplomatic marriages, where personal unions served as instruments of statecraft rather than expressions of romantic attachment. The marriage itself, celebrated with appropriate ceremony at the Lombard court, lasted barely a year before Charles repudiated his bride and sent her back to her father's kingdom. Contemporary sources provide little insight into the specific reasons for this dramatic reversal, though the timing suggests that Charles had concluded that Lombard alliance offered fewer advantages than continued papal support. The repudiation created a personal insult that King Desiderius could not ignore, transforming what had been a diplomatic marriage into a casus belli that would soon draw the Frankish king into his first major foreign war. Pope Adrian I, who had succeeded Stephen III in 772 AD, found himself caught between his desire for Frankish protection and his concern about Charles's unpredictable diplomatic initiatives. The new pope possessed considerable political experience, having served in various administrative capacities before his elevation, and he understood that the growing tension between Charles and Desiderius threatened to destabilize the entire Italian peninsula. Adrian's correspondence with the Frankish court during this period reveals his attempts to maintain diplomatic flexibility while preparing for the possibility that military intervention might become necessary to protect papal territories. The crisis escalated dramatically when Desiderius began applying military pressure on papal territories in central Italy, apparently hoping to force Adrian thus to crown Carloman's sons as legitimate Frankish kings and thereby create an alternative source of authority that could challenge Charles's consolidation of power. This Lombard strategy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Frankish succession politics, but it fundamentally misread Charles's character and capabilities. Rather than weakening his position, the Lombard threat provided Charles with exactly the justification he needed to pursue the territorial expansion that his ambitious nature demanded. Charles's preparations for his first Italian campaign revealed the administrative and military capabilities he had developed during his early years of independent rule. The logistics of moving a substantial Frankish army across the Alps required careful coordination with local officials throughout his territories, systematic collection of supplies and equipment, and diplomatic negotiations with various alpine communities that controlled the mountain passes. The king's personal involvement in these preparations demonstrated his recognition that successful conquest required more than martial valour. It demanded meticulous attention to the practical details that determined whether armies could maintain their effectiveness in foreign territories. The Frankish force that assembled for the Italian expedition represented the military innovations that had characterised Carolingian warfare since the time of Charles Martel. Heavy cavalry formed the core of the army, equipped with the stirrups and improved saddles that enabled mounted warriors to deliver devastating charges against enemy formations. Infantry units provided tactical flexibility and siege capabilities, while specialised engineers brought the equipment necessary to reduce fortified positions. The army's composition reflected Charles's understanding that conquering the Lombard kingdom would require both battlefield victories and the systematic reduction of fortified cities that controlled strategic territories. The crossing of the Alps in 773 AD marked Charles's first major independent military campaign and provided his initial experience with the challenges of projecting Frankish power beyond the traditional boundaries of his kingdom. The army divided into two columns to navigate the mountain passes, with Charles personally leading the main force through the Mont Cenis Pass, while a secondary force under his uncle Bernard crossed via the Great St. Bernard Pass. This strategy reflected both practical considerations about the capacity of individual routes to support large armies and tactical awareness that multiple approaches would complicate Lombard defensive preparations. King Desiderius had positioned his forces to contest the Alpine passes, recognising that successful defence of his kingdom required preventing the Franks from establishing themselves in the Po Valley. The Lombard strategy relied on the assumption that the difficulties of mountain warfare would offset Frankish numerical and tactical advantages, potentially forcing Charles to abandon his invasion before achieving decisive results. However, the Lombard king underestimated both the determination of his opponent and the effectiveness of Frankish military organisation in overcoming logistical challenges. The initial encounters between Frankish and Lombard forces demonstrated the tactical superiority that Carolingian military reforms had achieved over traditional Germanic warfare. Frankish heavy cavalry proved particularly effective in the relatively open terrain of the Po Valley, where their mobility and shock power could be fully utilised against Lombard formations that relied primarily on infantry tactics. The psychological impact of these early victories extended far beyond their immediate military significance, as news of Frankish success encouraged pro-Carolingian factions throughout northern Italy, while demoralising Lombard supporters who had expected their mountain defences to prove more effective. Charles's conduct during these initial engagements revealed the personal leadership style that would characterise his entire military career. Rather than directing operations from a safe distance, the Frankish king positioned himself at the forefront of his army, sharing the dangers and hardships of campaign life with his warriors. This approach served multiple purposes. It demonstrated his personal courage in the traditional manner expected of Germanic war leaders, provided him with first-hand information about battlefield conditions, and enabled him to make rapid tactical adjustments based on direct observation of enemy behaviour. The Siege of Pavia, which began in autumn 773 AD, represented the decisive phase of Charles's first Italian campaign and his initial experience with the complex challenges of medieval siege warfare. Pavia, the Lombard capital, occupied a naturally strong position at the confluence of the Ticino and Po rivers, surrounded by substantial fortifications that had been strengthened over several centuries of intermittent warfare. The city's defences included not only traditional walls and towers, but also sophisticated water management systems that could flood surrounding areas to impede attackers, making direct assault extremely hazardous for besieging forces. Charles approached the siege with characteristic thoroughness, establishing multiple camps around the city perimeter and organising systematic efforts to cut off all supply routes that might enable the defenders to maintain their resistance. The Frankish army constructed elaborate siege works, including earthen ramparts, wooden towers, and various mechanical devices designed to breach or overcome the city's fortifications. These preparations required enormous quantities of timber, stone, and metal, much of which had to be transported considerable distances or extracted from local sources through negotiations with Italian communities that were carefully weighing their options between Lombard and Frankish rule. The prolonged nature of the siege created significant challenges for maintaining army morale and effectiveness during the harsh winter months of 774 AD. Frankish warriors, accustomed to seasonal campaigns that concluded before the onset of cold weather, found themselves committed to an extended operation that tested their endurance and discipline in unfamiliar ways. Charles addressed these challenges through a combination of personal example, material incentives, and strategic diversions that kept his forces engaged while maintaining pressure on the besieged city. During the winter months, Charles demonstrated his growing sophistication as both a military commander and a political leader by conducting extensive diplomatic negotiations with various Italian factions that might influence the outcome of his campaign. These discussions included not only military allies who could provide direct support for the siege, but also ecclesiastical leaders, urban merchants, and rural magnates whose cooperation would be essential for establishing effective Frankish administration in conquered territories. The king's willingness to engage in these complex negotiations, while personally supervising military operations, revealed his recognition that lasting conquest required political as well as military success. The fall of Pavia in June 774 AD marked not only the end of effective Lombard resistance, but also Charles's transformation from a regional Frankish king into a major European power, with direct influence over Italian affairs. King Desiderius's surrender, negotiated through intermediaries after months of increasingly desperate resistance, included his formal abdication and agreement to retire to a Frankish monastery, effectively ending the Lombard kingdom that had dominated northern Italy for more than 2 centuries. Charles's assumption of the title King of the Lombards represented a dramatic expansion of Carolingian authority and established precedents that would influence European political development for centuries to come. The establishment of Frankish administration in northern Italy required Charles to navigate the complex relationships between secular authority, ecclesiastical privilege, and local autonomy that characterized Italian political culture. Unlike the relatively homogeneous territories of Francia, where Carolingian authority built upon existing Frankish legal and administrative traditions, northern Italy presented a bewildering array of competing jurisdictions, legal systems, and cultural practices that had evolved under Roman, Byzantine, and Lombard influences. Charles's initial administrative appointments reflected his awareness that effective governance would require accommodation with existing power structures, rather than wholesale replacement of Italian institutions with Frankish alternatives. The delicate balance between secular rule and papal relations became particularly complex following Charles's Italian conquests, as his direct control over northern Italian territories created new opportunities for both cooperation and conflict with ecclesiastical authorities. Pope Adrian I welcomed the elimination of Lombard threats to papal independence, but he also recognised that Frankish control over northern Italy might eventually pose different challenges to ecclesiastical autonomy. Charles's early interactions with Italian bishops and abbots revealed his understanding that successful integration of his new territories would require careful attention to religious sensibilities and respect for established ecclesiastical privileges, even as he asserted ultimate secular authority over all aspects of governance. The destruction of the Irminsul in 772 AD marked Charles's most provocative assault on Saxon religious identity and territorial independence. This towering wooden pillar, revered by Saxon tribes as the cosmic axis connecting Earth to the heavens, stood in the sacred grove near Eresburg, serving as both a religious focal point and a symbol of Saxon resistance to Frankish expansion. Contemporary Saxon belief held that the Irminsul supported the entire universe, making its destruction not merely an act of military conquest, but a direct challenge to the fundamental cosmology that unified the disparate Saxon tribes. Charles's decision to personally oversee the demolition demonstrated his understanding that this campaign would require more than traditional territorial conquest. It demanded the systematic dismantling of Saxon cultural and religious identity. The Frankish army that approached Eresburg in the summer of 772 AD represented Charles's most carefully planned military expedition to date. Unlike his Italian campaigns, which had focused on defeating organised kingdoms with established political structures, the Saxon territories presented a fundamentally different challenge. The Saxons maintained no centralised monarchy or permanent capital that could be captured to ensure submission. Instead, they organised themselves into numerous semi-autonomous tribes, each controlling specific territories along the rivers and forests that stretched from the Rhine to the Elbe. The Westphalians dominated the western regions, while the Engrians controlled the central areas around the Weser River, and the Isphalians held territories extending toward the Elbe. Each group maintained its own assembly of free warriors, religious traditions, and military leadership, making comprehensive conquest a far more complex undertaking than Charles had previously attempted. The fortress of Eresburg occupied a strategic position controlling access routes into Saxon territory, built on elevated ground overlooking the Diemel River valley. Saxon engineers had constructed substantial earthwork defences supplemented by wooden palisades and stone foundations salvaged from earlier Roman installations in the region. The fortress served multiple functions. It provided a secure base for Saxon raids into Frankish territory, controlled trade routes that connected Saxon lands with southern markets, and housed the religious centre where tribal assemblies gathered to make collective decisions about war and peace. Charles recognised that capturing Eresburg would not only eliminate a military threat, but also provide him with a forward base for deeper penetration into Saxon lands. The siege itself unfolded with brutal efficiency that reflected Frankish experience in reducing fortified positions throughout Charles's expanding domains. Frankish engineers employed sophisticated siege techniques, constructing wooden towers that enabled archers to target defenders on the walls, while battering rams and mining operations systematically weakened the fortress's defences. The defenders fought with desperate courage, understanding that surrender would likely result in forced conversion to Christianity and submission to Frankish political authority. Saxon warriors employed every available defensive technique, including the use of fire arrows to destroy Frankish siege equipment and nighttime sorties designed to disrupt the besiegers' operations. The fall of Eresburg after several weeks of intense fighting provided Charles with his first major victory in Saxon territory, But the real psychological impact came with the destruction of the Irminsul itself. Frankish soldiers, many of whom had participated in the Italian campaigns and understood the importance of symbolic victories, approached the sacred grove with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The Irminsul itself stood nearly 30 feet tall, carved from a massive oak trunk and decorated with intricate Germanic symbols that represented various aspects of Saxon cosmology. Charles ordered his men to strip the pillar of its precious metal ornaments before cutting it down with axes, while Frankish priests conducted Christian ceremonies designed to consecrate the site to their own religious purposes. The systematic plundering of the Irminsul's treasury revealed the extent to which this religious centre had served as a repository for Saxon wealth accumulated through generations of successful raiding and tribute collection. Frankish chroniclers recorded the discovery of substantial quantities of gold and silver ornaments, precious weapons, and ceremonial objects that represented centuries of Saxon craftsmanship and accumulated prosperity. Charles distributed much of this treasure among his warriors, following traditional Germanic practices that ensured army loyalty, while simultaneously demonstrating the material benefits of successful conquest. However, he reserved the most precious items for donation to Frankish monasteries and churches, symbolically transferring Saxon wealth to Christian institutions. The destruction of the Irminsul sent shockwaves throughout Saxon society that extended far beyond its immediate military significance. Saxon religious leaders, known as priests or wise women depending on their specific roles, had taught for generations that the pillar's destruction would herald cosmic catastrophe and the collapse of their entire world order. When the immediate aftermath produced no supernatural disasters, some Saxons began questioning traditional beliefs, while others interpreted the destruction as a temporary setback that required more determined resistance to restore cosmic balance. This religious crisis created divisions within Saxon society that Charles would systematically exploit in subsequent campaigns. Charles's establishment of a permanent Frankish garrison at Eresburg represented his recognition that Saxon conquest would require sustained military presence rather than the seasonal campaigns that had characterized earlier Carolingian warfare. The garrison included not only warriors but also administrators, craftsmen and clergy who began the process of transforming the captured fortress into a centre of Frankish authority. Frankish engineers strengthened the existing fortifications using stone construction techniques that surpassed Saxon building capabilities, while also constructing a Christian chapel on the site where the Irminsul had stood. These physical changes served as constant reminders of the new political and religious order that Charles intended to impose throughout Saxon lands. The initial Saxon response to the Eresburg disaster demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of their decentralized political system. Individual tribal leaders could respond quickly to local threats without waiting for lengthy consultations with distant allies. But coordinating large-scale resistance proved extremely difficult when different Saxon groups maintained competing interests and traditional rivalries. The Westphalians, who had suffered most directly from the Frankish invasion, immediately began organising retaliatory raids against Frankish territories, while the Engrians and Eastphalians adopted more cautious approaches that reflected their greater distance from immediate danger. Widukind emerged as the most effective Saxon resistance leader during this critical period, though his exact origins and early career remain obscured by the legendary status he achieved in later Saxon traditions. Contemporary Frankish sources identify him as a member of the Westphalian nobility with extensive kinship connections throughout Saxon society, suggesting that his authority derived from traditional aristocratic networks rather than purely military achievements. His ability to coordinate resistance efforts across tribal boundaries indicated sophisticated political skills that complemented his apparent tactical abilities. Frankish chroniclers grudgingly acknowledged his effectiveness as a military commander, while consistently portraying him as a pagan obstacle to Christian civilization. The seasonal nature of early medieval warfare created a predictable rhythm that both sides learned to exploit for strategic advantage. Charles typically launched his Saxon campaigns during late spring or early summer, when improved weather conditions facilitated the movement of large armies and their supply trains through the difficult terrain that characterized the Saxon frontier. These expeditions usually concluded before autumn, when deteriorating weather and the need to harvest crops in Frankish territories required the army's withdrawal. Saxons quickly learned to anticipate these patterns, often avoiding direct confrontation during Frankish invasions, while preparing counterattacks that could be launched after the main Carolingian forces had withdrawn to winter quarters. The construction of additional Frankish fortresses throughout conquered Saxon territories became Charles's primary method for maintaining year-round pressure on Saxon resistance, while providing secure bases for future military operations. Each fortress required substantial resources to build and maintain, including not only the initial construction materials and labour, but also permanent garrisons, supply systems, and administrative personnel. The locations chosen for these installations reflected careful strategic planning that considered factors such as control over river crossings, access to supply routes, proximity to Saxon population centres, and defensive advantages provided by natural terrain features. Frankish fortress construction techniques demonstrated the technological superiority that gave Carolingian forces significant advantages over Saxon opponents. While Saxons relied primarily on earthwork defences supplemented by wooden palisades, Frankish engineers employed stone construction methods derived from Roman military traditions and refined through centuries of experience in fortifying strategic positions throughout the Carolingian domains. These stone fortifications could withstand Saxon siege attempts while providing secure bases for Frankish cavalry operations that exploited their mobility advantages over Saxon infantry forces. The establishment of Christian bishoprics in conquered Saxon territories represented Charles's most systematic attempt to transform Saxon society through religious conversion and institutional control. Unlike his military campaigns, which focused on immediate tactical objectives, the creation of ecclesiastical administration required long-term planning and substantial investment in personnel and resources. Charles recruited bishops and clergy from throughout his domains, seeking individuals who combined theological training with administrative experience and the personal courage necessary to operate in hostile territory. These religious officials faced the enormous challenge of converting populations that had maintained pagan traditions for centuries, while also establishing the institutional infrastructure necessary for effective ecclesiastical governance. The forced conversion policies implemented in Saxon territories reflected Charles's belief that political submission and religious conformity were inseparable aspects of successful conquest. Saxon captives faced stark choices: accept Christian baptism and acknowledge Frankish political authority, or face execution, enslavement, or exile from their ancestral lands. These harsh measures generated enormous resentment among Saxon populations, while creating practical problems for Frankish administrators who struggled to distinguish between genuine converts and those who had accepted baptism purely to avoid punishment. The superficial nature of many forced conversions became apparent when Saxon communities repeatedly reverted to pagan practices as soon as Frankish military pressure diminished. The cycles of rebellion and submission that characterized Saxon resistance created enormous frustration for Charles, who had expected that decisive military victories would produce lasting political control as they had in his Italian campaigns. Saxon leaders like Widukind proved remarkably adept at exploiting the temporary nature of Frankish military presence, submitting when faced with overwhelming force but resuming resistance activities as soon as circumstances permitted. This pattern forced Charles to commit increasing resources to Saxon campaigns while limiting his ability to pursue other territorial objectives that might have offered greater strategic advantages. The massacre at Verdun in 782 AD represented the most extreme expression of Charles's growing frustration with Saxon resistance and his determination to break the cycle of rebellion through terror. Following a significant Saxon victory over Frankish forces at the Suntal Hills, where Saxon warriors had ambushed and destroyed a Carolingian army, Charles ordered the execution of approximately 4,500 Saxon prisoners who had been accused of participating in the rebellion. The mass execution took place at Verdun on the Aller River, with Frankish soldiers systematically beheading Saxon captives in what contemporary sources describe as a single day of slaughter. This brutal act shocked even hardened medieval observers and demonstrated Charles's willingness to employ extreme measures to achieve his political objectives. The Verdun massacre produced immediate tactical results by temporarily suppressing Saxon resistance, but its long-term consequences proved far more complex than Charles had anticipated. The scale of the killings created martyrs for Saxon resistance movements while generating widespread revulsion that extended beyond Saxon territories to include some Frankish nobles and clergy who questioned the morality of such extreme measures. Alcuin of York, one of Charles's most trusted advisors, later criticised the massacre in correspondence that revealed the ethical tensions created by the king's increasingly brutal approach to Saxon conquest. Saxon resistance strategies evolved significantly in response to Frankish military pressure and the changing political landscape created by Charles's fortress construction program. Rather than attempting to match Frankish capabilities in conventional warfare, Saxon leaders increasingly relied on guerrilla tactics that exploited their intimate knowledge of local terrain and their ability to blend into civilian populations. Saxon warriors became experts at conducting lightning raids against isolated Frankish garrisons, supply convoys, and administrative centres before disappearing into the vast forests and marshlands that covered much of their territory. These tactics proved extremely effective at maintaining Saxon morale while imposing continuous costs on Frankish occupation forces. The role of Saxon women in resistance activities demonstrated the comprehensive nature of opposition to Frankish rule throughout Saxon society. While Frankish sources focus primarily on male military leaders like Widukind, archaeological evidence and fragmentary references in contemporary documents suggest that Saxon women played crucial roles in maintaining resistance networks, preserving traditional religious practices, and transmitting cultural knowledge that sustained Saxon identity under foreign occupation. Saxon priestesses, in particular, appear to have been instrumental in maintaining pagan religious traditions, despite intensive Christian missionary efforts and the severe penalties imposed on those caught practicing traditional rituals. The economic dimensions of the Saxon Wars created significant challenges for Charles's broader political objectives while generating substantial costs that strained Carolingian resources. Unlike his Italian conquests, which had provided immediate access to wealthy cities and established trade networks, Saxon territories offered primarily agricultural resources and limited opportunities for extracting tribute that could offset campaign expenses. The need to maintain permanent garrisons throughout Saxon lands required continuous investment in military personnel, fortification maintenance, and supply systems that diverted resources from other potential conquests or internal development projects. The diplomatic overture that would lead Charles into his most infamous military disaster arrived at the Frankish court in early 778 AD through envoys representing Sulayman ibn al-Arabi al-Kelbi, the Wali of Barcelona and Girona. These Muslim governors, caught in the devastating civil war that had erupted across the Iberian Peninsula following the Abbasid revolution's overthrow of the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, sought Christian allies against their co-religionist enemies who controlled Cordoba. The irony of Muslim leaders requesting military assistance from the most prominent Christian warrior king in Western Europe was not lost on contemporary observers, yet the political calculations driving this unlikely alliance reflected the complex realities of 8th century Mediterranean politics. where religious boundaries often proved less significant than immediate territorial and dynastic interests. The Umayyad Emirate established by Abd al-Rahman I in Cordoba represented the sole surviving remnant of the dynasty that had once ruled the entire Islamic world from Damascus. Having escaped the Abbasid purges that eliminated most of his family, Abd al-Rahman had successfully established his authority over much of Al-Andalus through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and the support of Syrian Arab settlers who had accompanied the original Muslim conquest of Iberia. However, his consolidation of power inevitably created opposition among local Muslim governors who had enjoyed considerable autonomy during the chaotic period following the collapse of centralized Umayyad authority. These regional strongmen, many of whom commanded substantial military forces and controlled strategically important cities, viewed the new emir's centralizing policies as direct threats to their established privileges and territorial independence. Sulayman ibn al-Arabi represented the most powerful of these dissident governors, controlling not only Barcelona and Girona, but also maintaining significant influence throughout the eastern Pyrenean regions that formed the natural boundary between Al-Andalus and Francia. His territories included some of the most prosperous cities in northern Iberia, with Barcelona serving as a major Mediterranean port that facilitated trade connections extending from Constantinople to Tunis. The wealth generated by this commercial activity provided Sulayman with the financial resources necessary to maintain substantial military forces, while also offering attractive incentives for potential allies who might assist him in his struggle against Cordoba. His decision to approach Charles reflected both his desperate military situation and his sophisticated understanding of European political dynamics. The Muslim envoys who presented Sulayman's proposal at Charles's court brought with them detailed intelligence about the military situation in Al-Andalus, including assessments of Abd al-Rahman's forces, descriptions of the fortifications protecting major cities, and promises of substantial territorial concessions that would extend Frankish authority south of the Pyrenees for the first time in Carolingian history. These negotiations took place against the backdrop of Charles's ongoing Saxon campaigns, which had demonstrated both his military capabilities and his willingness to commit substantial resources to territorial expansion. The envoys emphasized that Sulayman's rebellion enjoyed widespread support among the Muslim population of northern Iberia, suggesting that a relatively modest Frankish intervention might achieve disproportionately significant results. Charles's decision to accept Sulayman's invitation reflected his characteristic confidence in Frankish military superiority, combined with his growing ambition to expand Carolingian authority into new territories that could provide both strategic advantages and material rewards. The prospect of establishing Frankish control over wealthy Iberian cities appealed to a king who had already demonstrated his ability to integrate conquered territories into his expanding realm. Moreover, the opportunity to strike against Muslim territories aligned with the militant Christian ideology that increasingly characterized Carolingian political culture, offering the possibility of achieving both territorial gains and religious merit through warfare against infidels. The military preparations for the Iberian expedition revealed the sophisticated logistical capabilities that Charles had developed through his previous campaigns in Italy and Saxony. The army that assembled in the spring of 778 AD represented one of the largest forces Charles had ever commanded, drawing contingents from throughout his domains and including not only Frankish warriors but also Lombard troops from his recently conquered Italian territories. The expedition's supply requirements necessitated extensive advance planning, as the army would need to traverse the difficult terrain of the Pyrenees while maintaining sufficient provisions to conduct siege operations against heavily fortified Muslim cities. Frankish quartermasters arranged for supply depots along the planned route, while also negotiating agreements with local communities that could provide additional resources during the campaign. The composition of Charles's army reflected his understanding that success in Iberian warfare would require diverse military capabilities suited to the varied challenges of siege warfare, mountain fighting, and operations in unfamiliar terrain. Heavy cavalry formed the core of the force, equipped with the improved armour and weapons that had proven so effective in previous Carolingian campaigns. Infantry units included both traditional Frankish foot soldiers and specialised troops trained in siege techniques, while engineers brought the equipment necessary to reduce fortified positions. The inclusion of Lombard contingents provided additional manpower, while also demonstrating Charles's ability to integrate recently conquered populations into his military system. The crossing of the Pyrenees in early summer 778 AD proceeded more smoothly than many participants had anticipated, as Sulayman's agents had prepared the route and arranged for local guides who could navigate the treacherous mountain passes. The Frankish army divided into multiple columns to facilitate movement through the narrow defiles, while also reducing the logistical burden on individual supply lines. Charles personally led the main force through the pass at Roncevaux, following ancient Roman roads that still provided the most practical route for large armies crossing between Gaul and Iberia. The mountain crossing exposed Frankish warriors to their first direct experience of Iberian geography and climate, as the Mediterranean environment south of the Pyrenees differed markedly from the temperate regions they knew in Francia. The initial phase of the campaign unfolded according to Charles's expectations, with Sulayman's forces providing the promised support and several smaller Muslim strongholds submitting without resistance. The Frankish army's reputation for military effectiveness, enhanced by reports of Charles's recent successes in Italy and Saxony, encouraged some Muslim commanders to negotiate surrender terms, rather than risk the destruction that typically accompanied unsuccessful resistance to Carolingian forces. These early successes reinforced Charles's confidence in the expedition's prospects, while providing his troops with their first taste of Iberian wealth, as surrendering cities offered tribute payments designed to secure favourable treatment from their new Christian overlords. The siege of Zaragoza, however, revealed the limitations of Sulayman's influence and the complexity of Muslim politics in Al-Andalus. The city's governor, Hussein ibn Yahya al-Ansari, had initially appeared sympathetic to Sulayman's rebellion, but the arrival of a substantial Frankish army apparently convinced him that supporting Christian invaders posed greater risks than accommodation with Abd al-Rahman's emirate. Zaragoza's formidable defences, built upon Roman foundations and strengthened through centuries of Muslim occupation, presented Charles with his most challenging siege operation since the conquest of Pavia. The city's position on the Ebro River provided access to water supplies that could sustain a prolonged defence, while its substantial garrison included experienced warriors who understood that surrender to Christian forces might result in forced conversion or enslavement. The siege operations that Charles initiated around Zaragoza demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Frankish military capabilities when applied to Iberian conditions. Frankish siege engines, designed primarily for operations against Germanic and Lombard fortifications, proved less effective against the sophisticated defensive architecture that characterized major Muslim cities in Al-Andalus. Zaragoza's engineers had incorporated advanced techniques derived from Byzantine and Islamic military traditions, including complex gate systems, carefully designed fields of fire for defensive artillery, and underground passages that enabled defenders to conduct sorties against besieging forces. The city's substantial civilian population also provided a reservoir of manpower that could be mobilized for defensive operations, unlike the primarily military garrisons that Charles had encountered in his previous campaigns. The prolonged nature of the siege created significant challenges for maintaining Frankish army morale and effectiveness in the unfamiliar Iberian environment. The intense summer heat of the Ebro Valley proved particularly difficult for warriors accustomed to the cooler climates of northern Europe, while the army's supply lines became increasingly vulnerable as the campaign extended far longer than originally anticipated. Frankish foraging parties encountered determined resistance from local Muslim populations who viewed the Christian invaders as a direct threat to their religious and cultural identity, making it extremely difficult to supplement official supply convoys with resources extracted from the surrounding countryside. Charles's negotiations with various Muslim factions during the siege revealed the bewildering complexity of Iberian politics and the naive assumptions that had underpinned his decision to intervene in the Umayyad civil war. The religious unity that Frankish observers attributed to Muslim al-Andalus masked profound ethnic, tribal, and political divisions that created shifting patterns of alliance and opposition that defied easy comprehension. Arab settlers from Syria and Egypt maintained distinct identities and interests from Berber populations, who had provided much of the military manpower for the original conquest, while indigenous Iberian converts to Islam navigated between their new religious identity and their ancestral connections to pre-Islamic traditions. The Frankish king's attempts to exploit these divisions through diplomatic initiatives often backfired, as his Christian identity made him an inherently suspect negotiating partner for Muslim leaders who feared that any association with infidel invaders would undermine their legitimacy among their own followers. The deteriorating military situation around Zaragoza coincided with disturbing reports reaching Charles about renewed Saxon resistance in the northeastern frontiers of his kingdom. Widukind had apparently exploited the king's absence in Iberia to launch a major offensive that threatened to undo years of costly Frankish conquests in Saxon territories. These reports placed Charles in an impossible strategic position. Continuing the siege of Zaragoza offered uncertain prospects for success, while allowing Saxon resistance to consolidate could result in the loss of territories that had cost enormous resources to conquer. The king's advisors urged immediate withdrawal from Iberia to address the more pressing Saxon threat, arguing that Frankish interests were better served by consolidating existing conquests rather than pursuing uncertain gains in unfamiliar territories. Charles's decision to abandon the siege and withdraw from Iberia reflected his recognition that the expedition had failed to achieve its primary objectives, while creating new vulnerabilities in other parts of his kingdom. The retreat began in late July 778 AD, with the Frankish army conducting a fighting withdrawal through hostile territory where Muslim forces harassed their columns and local populations provided intelligence to their enemies. The logistical challenges of moving a large army through difficult terrain while maintaining defensive formations against persistent enemy pressure tested Frankish military capabilities in ways that previous campaigns had not encountered. The army's morale suffered as warriors recognized that they were abandoning a failed campaign that had cost substantial casualties while producing minimal territorial or material gains. The composition of the retreating Frankish force reflected Charles's attempt to maintain military effectiveness while expediting the withdrawal from Iberian territory. The main army followed the most direct route toward the Pyrenean passes, while a substantial rearguard protected the baggage train and ensured that Muslim pursuers could not interfere with the retreat. Charles assigned command of this rearguard to some of his most trusted military leaders, including Roland, the prefect of the Breton March, whose responsibilities included coordinating with local guides and maintaining communication between the main force and the trailing elements of the army. The rearguard's composition included elite Frankish warriors, Breton auxiliaries familiar with mountain warfare, and Gascon troops whose knowledge of Pyrenean terrain was considered essential for navigating the treacherous passes. The approach to Roncevaux Pass in early August 778 AD found the Frankish army stretched across several miles of difficult mountain terrain, with the main force already beginning the descent toward Gascon territory, while the rearguard still climbed toward the highest elevations of the pass. The narrow defiles and steep slopes that characterized this section of the Pyrenees created natural bottlenecks where large armies became extremely vulnerable to attacks from forces occupying the commanding heights. Local Basque populations, who maintained their independence through intimate knowledge of mountain warfare and careful neutrality, between the larger powers that contested control over the Pyrenean region, observed the Frankish retreat with keen interest in the opportunities it might provide for advancing their own interests. The Basque attack on the Frankish rearguard at Roncevaux demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of mountain warfare tactics against even elite military forces operating in unfavourable terrain. Basque warriors, positioned on the heights overlooking the pass, launched their assault at the moment when the Frankish column was most extended and vulnerable, with the rearguard isolated from potential support by the main army's position several miles ahead. The attackers employed tactics perfectly suited to the mountainous environment. They rolled boulders down the slopes to disrupt Frankish formations, used javelins and arrows to target individual warriors from positions that were difficult to reach, and conducted coordinated rushes that exploited gaps in the Frankish defensive line created by the difficult terrain. The Frankish rearguard's response to the Basque ambush revealed both the strengths and limitations of Carolingian military training when applied to unconventional warfare situations. Roland and his subordinate commanders attempted to maintain formation discipline while organising counterattacks against Basque positions, but the steep terrain and scattered nature of the enemy forces made coordinated responses extremely difficult. Frankish heavy cavalry, the decisive factor in most Carolingian military successes, proved nearly useless in the narrow confines of the mountain pass, where horses could not manoeuvre effectively and riders became easy targets for attackers positioned above them. The rearguard's infantry proved more effective in the close quarters fighting that characterised the battle, but their numbers were insufficient to cover all the approaches that Basque warriors used to infiltrate Frankish positions. The death of Roland during the fighting at Roncevaux eliminated one of Charles's most capable military commanders, while also creating the historical foundation for the legendary traditions that would later transform this military disaster into one of the most celebrated episodes in medieval literature. Contemporary sources provide limited details about Roland's specific role in the battle or the circumstances of his death, but later accounts describe him as fighting with desperate courage until overwhelmed by superior numbers of enemy warriors. The loss of such a prominent figure, along with the destruction of the entire rearguard, represented a personal blow to Charles that extended beyond its immediate military significance to affect his relationships with the noble families whose sons had perished in the Pyrenean ambush. The transformation of the Roncevaux disaster into the literary masterpiece known as the Chanson de Roland demonstrated the remarkable capacity of medieval culture to convert military failure into spiritual triumph through the alchemy of heroic narrative. The historical reality of a Basque ambush, motivated by local political considerations, became, in the hands of later poets and chroniclers, an epic confrontation between Christian heroes and Muslim villains that embodied the religious conflicts defining medieval European identity. Roland's death, probably the result of tactical miscalculations in difficult terrain, was reimagined as a martyrdom that exemplified the highest ideals of Christian knighthood and feudal loyalty. The process by which historical facts became legendary narrative reveals the complex relationship between political necessity and cultural memory in medieval society. Charles's court had obvious reasons for minimising the significance of a military defeat that had cost substantial resources while failing to achieve any meaningful objectives. The transformation of Roncevaux into a tale of heroic sacrifice served multiple purposes. It honoured the memory of fallen warriors, provided moral lessons about loyalty and courage that supported Carolingian political ideology, and deflected attention from the strategic miscalculations that had led to the disaster. The substitution of Muslim enemies for the actual Basque attackers reflected both the religious prejudices of later medieval audiences and the political utility of portraying the defeat as part of the broader Christian struggle against Islamic expansion. The resolution of the Saxon crisis following Widukin's submission in 785 AD freed Charles to address the increasingly complex situation developing along his southeastern frontier, where the Bavarian duchy under Tassilo III had evolved into a quasi-independent state that challenged fundamental assumptions about Carolingian authority. The relationship between the Frankish crown and Bavaria had deteriorated steadily since Charles's consolidation of power, as Tassilo leveraged his duchy's strategic position between the Frankish heartlands and the Byzantine sphere of influence to pursue policies that often contradicted Carolingian interests. The Bavarian duke's marriage to Liutperga, daughter of the former Lombard king Desiderius, had created lasting tensions with Charles, who viewed this alliance as a deliberate attempt to construct an anti-Carolingian coalition that could threaten the stability of his entire eastern frontier. Tassilo III represented the last remnant of the old Germanic tradition of autonomous ducal authority that had characterized the Frankish kingdoms before the Carolingian consolidation. His family had governed Bavaria for nearly a century, establishing deep roots throughout the duchy's ecclesiastical and secular hierarchies, while maintaining the complex network of personal relationships that enabled effective rule over Bavaria's diverse population. The duchy itself encompassed territories extending from the Danube Valley southward into the Alpine regions, including substantial portions of what would later become Austria, and significant influence over the Slavic populations that occupied the lands beyond the Enns River. This geographic position provided Bavaria with access to lucrative trade routes connecting northern Europe with the Byzantine Empire and Italy, generating revenues that enabled Tassilo to maintain military forces and administrative systems that rivaled those of many independent kingdoms. The theological disputes that had emerged during the 780s provided Charles with the pretext he needed to challenge Bavarian autonomy without appearing to violate traditional Frankish legal principles regarding ducal authority. Tassilo's support for the adoptionist heresy, which had gained significant traction among Bavarian clergy, created an opportunity for Charles to present his intervention as a necessary defence of Orthodox Christianity, rather than mere territorial aggrandizement. The adoptionist controversy, which centred on theological debates about the nature of Christ's sonship, had originated in Spain but found receptive audiences throughout regions where local churches sought to maintain independence from Carolingian ecclesiastical control. Bavarian bishops who embraced adoptionist teachings provided Tassilo with religious justification for resisting Frankish interference in Bavarian affairs, while simultaneously offering Charles grounds for questioning the Duke's orthodoxy and, by extension, his fitness to govern Christian territories. The assembly that Charles convened at Worms in 787 AD demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the legal and political mechanisms necessary to legitimize his actions against Bavaria while maintaining the appearance of consultation with his magnates. The gathering included not only Frankish nobles and clergy, but also representatives from throughout Charles's domains, creating an impressive display of Carolingian authority that emphasized the isolation of Bavarian resistance. The formal charges presented against Tassilo encompassed both secular and religious accusations, breach of his oath of loyalty to the Frankish crown, failure to provide military service during recent campaigns, and tolerance of heretical teachings within his duchy. These accusations reflected careful legal preparation designed to establish grounds for deposition that would satisfy both Frankish law and canonical requirements for intervention in the affairs of a Christian ruler. Tassilo's appearance before the Worms assembly revealed the impossible position in which Bavarian independence had placed him, as any acknowledgement of Carolingian authority would undermine his duchy's autonomy, while outright defiance would provide Charles with clear justification for military intervention. The Duke's attempts to negotiate a compromise that would preserve Bavarian privileges while satisfying Frankish demands for submission demonstrated his recognition that his political options had become severely constrained by Charles's growing power and determination. Contemporary accounts describe Tassilo as attempting to present his case with dignity, while clearly understanding that the assembly's outcome had been predetermined by Charles's political requirements, rather than any genuine consideration of legal merits. The formal deposition of Tassilo III in 788 AD marked the end of the last significant challenge to Carolingian authority within the traditional boundaries of the Frankish kingdom, while simultaneously establishing precedents that would govern Charles's subsequent expansion into territories that had never acknowledged Frankish suzerainty. The Duke's forced retirement to a monastery followed established Carolingian practices for dealing with deposed rulers, providing a solution that eliminated political opposition while avoiding the complications that would have resulted from execution or exile. The confiscation of Bavarian ducal properties provided Charles with substantial resources that could be redistributed to reward loyal supporters, while also funding the military campaigns that would soon extend Carolingian authority far beyond the Danube frontier. The integration of Bavaria into the Carolingian administrative system required careful attention to the duchy's established institutions and the complex web of relationships that connected Bavarian nobles with their counterparts throughout southeastern Europe. Charles appointed Frankish administrators to key positions, while generally respecting existing property rights and local customs that did not directly conflict with Carolingian political requirements. This approach reflected lessons learned from his earlier experiences integrating conquered territories, particularly the recognition that successful governance required accommodation with local elites, rather than wholesale replacement of existing power structures. The Bavarian nobility's general acceptance of Carolingian rule demonstrated both their pragmatic recognition of Charles's overwhelming military superiority and their calculation that cooperation offered better prospects for preserving their interests than continued resistance. The elimination of Bavarian independence opened new strategic possibilities for Carolingian expansion eastward into the Danubian regions, where the Avar Khaganate had established one of the most formidable steppe empires in European history. The Avars, a Turkic people who had migrated westward during the 6th century, had constructed a military and political system that dominated the middle Danube valley, while extracting tribute from surrounding Slavic populations and maintaining diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire. Their capital, known to contemporary sources as the Ring, represented the largest fortified complex north of the Alps, consisting of multiple concentric defensive circles that protected the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of successful raiding and tribute collection throughout Central and Southeastern Europe. The Avar military system combined the traditional steppe warfare techniques of mounted archery and rapid mobility with sophisticated siege capabilities and diplomatic strategies that had enabled them to maintain their dominance despite pressure from expanding Frankish, Byzantine and Bulgar territories. Avar warriors employed composite bows that provided superior range and penetrating power compared to the weapons typically used by their sedentary neighbours, while their horses, bred specifically for endurance and speed, gave them tactical advantages that had proven decisive in numerous encounters with conventional European armies. The Khaganate's political structure, based on the dual leadership of the Khagan and the Jugurus, enabled rapid decision-making and coordinated military responses that had frustrated previous attempts by neighbouring powers to establish lasting control over Avar territories. Charles's initial diplomatic contacts with the Avar leadership during the late 780s reveal the complex calculations that governed steppe politics and the Khaganate's growing awareness that Carolingian expansion posed unprecedented threats to their established sphere of influence. Avar envoys who appeared at the Frankish court brought with them detailed intelligence about Carolingian military capabilities, while also attempting to negotiate agreements that would preserve Avar autonomy in exchange for recognition of Frankish suzerainty over disputed border regions. These negotiations demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic traditions that characterize steppe societies, as Avar representatives displayed impressive knowledge of European political developments, while maintaining the dignified bearing that reflected their empire's historical importance. The breakdown of diplomatic relations between the Carolingian kingdom and the Avar Khaganate resulted from fundamental incompatibilities between Charles's expansionist ambitions and Avar determination to maintain their traditional dominance over the Danubian regions. The Frankish king's demands for tribute payments and acknowledgement of Carolingian overlordship contradicted the basic principles of steppe political culture, which recognised only relationships between equals or the temporary submission of weaker powers to stronger ones. The Avar's counter-proposals, which offered limited cooperation in exchange for Frankish recognition of Avar territorial claims, failed to satisfy Charles's requirements for the complete submission that had characterised his previous conquests. The military preparations for the Avar campaigns represented Charles's most ambitious logistical undertaking, requiring coordination between multiple armies operating across vast distances while maintaining supply lines that extended far beyond the established infrastructure of Carolingian territories. The primary Frankish force, commanded by Charles himself, would advance along the Danube Valley through the former Bavarian territories, while a secondary army under his son Pepin would approach Avar positions from Italian bases, and a third force would operate in the northern regions where Avar influence extended into Slavic territories. This multi-pronged strategy reflected both the geographic scope of Avar power and Charles's recognition that conventional siege warfare would prove inadequate against an enemy whose military system emphasized mobility and the ability to retreat into vast territories where pursuit became extremely difficult. The Frankish armies that assembled for the Avar campaigns included not only traditional Carolingian forces, but also contingents from throughout Charles's expanding domains, creating a truly international coalition that demonstrated the resources available to the Carolingian war machine. Bavarian troops, recently incorporated into the Frankish military system, provided essential knowledge of local terrain and Avar tactical methods, while Lombard units contributed siege equipment and engineering expertise developed during centuries of Italian warfare. Saxon auxiliaries, drawn from recently pacified territories, offered additional manpower while also serving the political purpose of demonstrating their integration into Carolingian military culture through participation in campaigns against common enemies. The initial Frankish advances into Avar territory during 791 AD encountered resistance that differed markedly from the conventional warfare that had characterized Charles's previous campaigns. Avar forces avoided direct confrontation with the main Carolingian armies, instead conducting harassment attacks against supply convoys and isolated detachments while systematically destroying resources that might support extended Frankish operations. This strategy of strategic withdrawal and economic warfare reflected sophisticated understanding of Carolingian military limitations, particularly the logistical challenges that constrain the duration and scope of campaigns conducted far from Frankish supply bases. The discovery and systematic reduction of the outer defensive rings surrounding the Avar capital required innovative approaches to siege warfare that challenged conventional Carolingian military doctrine. The ring's defensive system consisted of multiple earthwork barriers extending over dozens of miles, each protected by wooden palisades and designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where Avar archers could inflict maximum casualties. Frankish engineers, drawing on experience gained during the Saxon campaigns and Italian sieges, developed new techniques for breaching these extensive fortifications while minimizing casualties among their own forces. The use of coordinated attacks against multiple points along the defensive perimeter prevented Avar defenders from concentrating their forces effectively, while also reducing the time required to overcome each successive barrier. The capture of the innermost ring in 795 AD provided Charles with access to treasure accumulations that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of his advisors and demonstrated the extraordinary wealth that the Avar Khaganate had extracted from 2 centuries of successful imperial expansion. The treasure chambers contained gold and silver objects from throughout Europe and beyond, including Byzantine coins, Lombard jewellery, Saxon metalwork, and exotic items that revealed the extent of Avar trade networks extending to Constantinople, Baghdad, and possibly even Central Asia. Frankish chroniclers struggled to quantify the immense wealth discovered in the ring, with some sources suggesting that the treasure required 15 four-ox wagons to transport, representing perhaps the largest single accumulation of precious metals and objects that had been assembled anywhere in medieval Europe. The systematic distribution of Avar treasure throughout Charles's domains served multiple political purposes, while also providing the material resources necessary to fund continued military expansion and administrative development. The king retained the most valuable items for his personal treasury, while distributing substantial portions among his nobles, clergy, and military commanders, according to carefully calculated formulas that rewarded loyalty and service, while encouraging continued support for future campaigns. Significant quantities of gold and silver were donated to monasteries and churches throughout the Carolingian realm, serving both religious purposes and the practical function of storing wealth in secure locations where it could be accessed during future emergencies. The establishment of the Ostmark as a permanent administrative unit governing the conquered Avar territories represented Charles's most systematic attempt to create stable frontier governance that could maintain Carolingian authority while adapting to the unique challenges posed by governing recently nomadic populations and defending against future threats from the east. The new march extended from the Enns River eastward to the Rab River, encompassing territories that would later form the core of the Austrian duchies, while also including significant portions of modern Hungary and Slovakia. The appointment of Gerald as the first Margrave reflected Charles's recognition that frontier governance required administrators who combined military experience with diplomatic skills and the personal courage necessary to operate in potentially hostile territory. The colonization policies implemented throughout the Ostmark demonstrated the Carolingian administration's sophisticated understanding of the demographic and economic requirements for establishing permanent control over conquered territories. Frankish settlers, drawn primarily from overpopulated regions of the kingdom's heartland, received land grants and tax incentives that encouraged migration to the frontier regions, while also creating loyal populations that could provide military service during future conflicts. These settlers brought with them advanced agricultural techniques and craft skills that increased the productivity of lands that had been used primarily for pastoralism under Avar rule, generating economic development that helped fund the substantial costs of frontier administration and defence. The systematic Christianization of the Ostmark required careful coordination between secular administrators and ecclesiastical authorities, while adapting missionary techniques to the diverse religious traditions that characterized the region's population. The establishment of new bishoprics at strategic locations provided institutional frameworks for religious conversion, while also creating administrative centres that could coordinate secular and spiritual governance throughout the march. Missionary activities targeted not only the remaining Avar populations, but also the numerous Slavic communities that had lived under Avar overlordship, offering these groups opportunities to improve their status through conversion to Christianity and acceptance of Carolingian political authority. The integration of Slavic populations into the Carolingian political system presented complex challenges that required innovative approaches to governance and cultural accommodation. Many Slavic communities had maintained their traditional social structures and religious practices despite centuries of Avar domination, creating situations where Carolingian administrators needed to work through existing leadership hierarchies while gradually introducing Frankish legal and administrative concepts. The policy of indirect rule that emerged from these practical necessities allowed Slavic chiefs to maintain local authority in exchange for acknowledging Carolingian overlordship and accepting Christian conversion, creating a flexible system that could accommodate diverse cultural traditions within the broader framework of Carolingian imperial authority. The strategic importance of the Ostmark as a buffer zone against future threats from the east became increasingly apparent as reports reached the Carolingian court about the migration of Magyar tribes westward across the Ukrainian steppes. These Finno-Ugric peoples, displaced by Turkic expansion and seeking new territories for their pastoral economy, represented a potential threat that could dwarf the challenges posed by the recently defeated Avars. The fortification systems established throughout the Ostmark reflected Charles's understanding that the region would likely face renewed pressure from steppe peoples, requiring permanent military installations and trained populations capable of defending Carolingian territories against enemies whose military capabilities and tactical approaches might surpass even those of their Avar predecessors. The crisis that would ultimately transform Charles from a powerful king into the first emperor of Western Europe since the fall of Rome began with a violent assault on Pope Leo III during a religious procession in Rome on April 25, 799 AD. The attack, orchestrated by a faction of Roman nobles led by Paschal and Campulus, nephews of the deceased Pope Adrian I, represented far more than personal animosity toward the pontiff. These aristocrats viewed Leo's election as an unacceptable elevation of a man they considered beneath their social station, and their grievances reflected deeper tensions within Roman society about papal authority, aristocratic privilege, and the proper relationship between ecclesiastical and secular power. The conspirators attempted to blind Leo and cut out his tongue, mutilations that would have rendered him incapable of performing his papal duties while sending a clear message about the consequences of challenging established Roman noble interests. The assault itself took place near the monastery of Saints Stephen and Sylvester, where Leo had been leading the traditional Litania major procession that marked the feast of St. Mark. Contemporary accounts describe the attackers dragging the Pope from his horse and attempting to carry out their brutal mutilations in full view of the horrified crowd that had gathered to witness the religious ceremony. The intervention of papal supporters, including members of the papal guard and loyal clergy, prevented the completion of the intended mutilations, though Leo suffered significant injuries that left him temporarily incapacitated. The conspirators, apparently believing they had succeeded in their primary objective, proclaimed Leo deposed and attempted to install their own candidate in his place, creating a schism within the Roman Church that threatened to destabilise papal authority throughout Western Europe. Leo's dramatic escape from Rome, aided by loyal supporters who smuggled him out of the city during the confusion following the attack, demonstrated the precarious nature of papal authority when confronted by determined aristocratic opposition. The Pope's journey northward across the Alps to seek Charles's protection represented both a personal plea for assistance and a strategic decision that would have profound implications for the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Leo's arrival at the Carolingian court at Paderborn in the summer of 799 AD created an unprecedented situation, as no pope had ever before sought refuge with a foreign ruler, effectively acknowledging that papal independence required the protection of secular power to survive challenges from within Rome itself. Charles's reception of the fugitive pope revealed his sophisticated understanding of the political opportunities created by Leo's desperate situation, while also demonstrating his genuine concern for the stability of the ecclesiastical authority throughout his domains. The Frankish king arranged for Leo to be received with full papal honours, including ceremonial processions and formal recognition of his continuing authority as Bishop of Rome, despite his physical absence from the Eternal City. This careful attention to protocol served multiple purposes. It reinforced Charles's position as the primary defender of papal authority, provided legitimacy for any future intervention in Roman affairs, and established precedents that would govern the relationship between Carolingian power and papal independence. The investigation that Charles ordered into the circumstances surrounding Leo's deposition revealed the complex web of accusations and counter-accusations that characterized Roman aristocratic politics during this period. The papal opponents presented detailed charges against Leo, including allegations of adultery, perjury, and various forms of corruption that they claimed disqualified him from continuing in office. These accusations reflected both genuine concerns about Leo's conduct and the political necessity of providing legal justification for what was essentially a power struggle between competing factions within Roman society. The Pope's defenders countered with their own accusations against the conspirators, creating a situation where determining the truth became less important than managing the political consequences of the crisis. Charles's decision to personally intervene in Roman affairs represented a calculated risk that could either establish his authority as the ultimate arbiter of ecclesiastical disputes or create dangerous precedents that might encourage future challenges to papal independence. The Frankish king's preparations for his journey to Rome during the autumn of 800 AD demonstrated his recognition that this intervention would require careful orchestration to achieve his political objectives while maintaining the appearance of respect for ecclesiastical autonomy. The royal entourage that accompanied Charles included not only military forces sufficient to ensure his security, but also legal experts, theologians, and diplomatic advisors who could provide guidance on the complex canonical and political issues that would need to be resolved. The Frankish army that crossed the Alps in late 800 AD represented a deliberate display of Carolingian power designed to discourage any thoughts of resistance among Roman factions, while also demonstrating Charles's commitment to resolving the papal crisis through his personal intervention. The force included elite units drawn from throughout the Carolingian domains, with particular emphasis on troops whose loyalty to Charles had been proven through years of successful campaigns. The army's composition also reflected diplomatic considerations, as Charles included contingents from his Italian territories to emphasize his legitimate authority south of the Alps while avoiding an overwhelming Germanic presence that might alienate Roman sensibilities. The king's approach to Rome in November 800 AD unfolded with careful attention to symbolic protocol that emphasized his role as protector of the church rather than conqueror of papal territories. Charles entered the city through formal ceremonies that acknowledged papal authority while simultaneously demonstrating his own power and the voluntary nature of his intervention. The Roman population, exhausted by months of political turmoil and economic disruption, generally welcomed the Frankish presence as a stabilizing force that promised to restore order and resolve the crisis that had paralyzed ecclesiastical administration throughout central Italy. The synod that Charles convened at St. Peter's Basilica in early December 800 AD brought together ecclesiastical and secular authorities from throughout Western Europe to address the charges against Leo III while establishing procedures for resolving similar crises in the future. The assembly included bishops from Francia, Italy, and other Carolingian territories, along with representatives of the Roman clergy and nobility who had interest in the outcome of the proceedings. The synod's composition reflected Charles's understanding that any resolution of the papal crisis would require broad acceptance among the diverse constituencies that comprised the Western Christian community, while also ensuring that Carolingian interests would be adequately represented in the final decisions. The legal proceedings that unfolded during the synod revealed the unprecedented nature of the situation, as no established canonical procedures existed for judging a pope who faced serious accusations from within his own ecclesiastical hierarchy. The principle that the first see is judged by no one, which would later become a fundamental doctrine of papal supremacy, had not yet achieved universal acceptance, creating uncertainty about the proper procedures for resolving disputes involving papal authority. Charles's legal advisors drew upon various sources of ecclesiastical law, including conciliar decisions, papal decretals, and Frankish legal traditions, to construct a framework for addressing the charges while maintaining respect for papal dignity. Leo III's dramatic oath of purgation on December 23, 800 AD, represented the climactic moment of the synod proceedings and demonstrated the Pope's confidence in his ability to maintain his position despite the serious accusations brought against him. Standing before the assembled bishops and nobles in St. Peter's Basilica, Leo swore a solemn oath denying the charges of misconduct, while invoking divine judgment upon himself if his testimony proved false. The ceremony itself drew upon ancient legal traditions that recognised oath-taking as a legitimate method for resolving disputes where direct evidence was unavailable or inconclusive, while also incorporating specifically Christian elements that emphasised the spiritual dimensions of papal authority. The acceptance of Leo's oath by the assembled synod effectively resolved the immediate crisis while establishing important precedents for future disputes involving papal authority. The bishops' decision to accept the Pope's sworn testimony reflected both their assessment of the evidence presented and their recognition that deposing a legitimately elected Pope would create dangerous precedents that could undermine ecclesiastical stability throughout Western Europe. Charles's support for this decision demonstrated his preference for working within existing ecclesiastical structures rather than imposing secular solutions that might compromise the independence of church authority. The events of Christmas Day 800 AD unfolded against this backdrop of recently resolved crisis and renewed papal authority, creating the specific circumstances that would transform Charles from a powerful king into the first Western emperor in more than 3 centuries. The Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica attracted an enormous congregation that included not only the Frankish court and Roman nobility, but also pilgrims and visitors from throughout Western Europe who had come to witness the resolution of the papal crisis. The basilica itself, built over the tomb of St. Peter and representing the spiritual heart of Western Christianity, provided a setting of unparalleled symbolic significance for the ceremony that would follow. Leo III's decision to crown Charles as emperor during the Christmas liturgy represented either a carefully orchestrated political masterstroke or a spontaneous gesture that capitalised on the unique circumstances created by the recent crisis and the king's presence in Rome. Contemporary sources provide conflicting accounts of whether Charles had advanced knowledge of the Pope's intentions, with some suggesting that the coronation came as a complete surprise to the Frankish king, while others imply that the ceremony had been planned through secret negotiations between papal and Carolingian representatives. The ambiguity surrounding these preparations reflected the political sensitivity of the situation, as both parties had reasons for maintaining plausible deniability about their roles in orchestrating such a momentous event. The coronation ceremony itself followed ancient Roman precedents while incorporating Christian elements that reflected the religious character of the new imperial authority. As Charles knelt in prayer before the altar of St. Peter, Pope Leo approached with a golden crown and placed it upon the king's head, while pronouncing the formula that proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The congregation's response, a ritual acclamation that echoed the practices of the late Roman Empire, completed the ceremony and provided popular validation for the new imperial dignity. The entire sequence of events took place within the context of the Christmas liturgy, emphasising the divine sanction that legitimised Charles's elevation to imperial status. The immediate reaction of the Frankish court to Charles's coronation revealed the complex emotions and political calculations that the ceremony had generated among those who witnessed this unprecedented event. Einhard's later account, which claimed that Charles expressed displeasure with the Pope's initiative and stated that he would not have entered the church if he had known what Leo intended, reflected either genuine surprise or calculated political positioning designed to minimise the appearance of papal dependence. The Frankish nobles present at the ceremony demonstrated their acceptance of their king's new status through their participation in the ritual acclamations, though many must have recognised that imperial dignity would bring new responsibilities and challenges that could affect their own positions within the Carolingian hierarchy. The revival of Western imperial authority, represented by Charles's coronation, created immediate diplomatic complications that would influence European politics for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire, which had maintained its claim to represent the continuation of Roman imperial authority since the fall of the Western Empire, in 476 AD, viewed Charles's assumption of the imperial title as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Constantinople's rule over the Roman world. The Empress Irene, who had recently seized power in Byzantium through the deposition and blinding of her son Constantine VI, found herself confronted by a Western rival whose imperial claims threatened to undermine her own authority and complicate Byzantine diplomatic relations throughout the Mediterranean world. The two emperors problem that emerged from Charles's coronation reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of imperial authority and the proper relationship between temporal and spiritual power in Christian society. Byzantine political theory maintained that imperial authority derived from God through an unbroken chain of succession extending back to Constantine the Great, making any alternative claimant to imperial dignity a usurper whose rule lacked divine sanction. Carolingian theorists, drawing upon different theological and legal traditions, argued that imperial authority could be transferred through papal coronation, particularly when the existing emperor had demonstrated unfitness for rule through moral failings or military incompetence. The diplomatic crisis that followed Charles's coronation manifested itself through a series of increasingly hostile exchanges between the Carolingian and Byzantine courts, as each side attempted to assert the superiority of its imperial claims while undermining the legitimacy of its rival. Byzantine diplomatic correspondents consistently referred to Charles by his royal rather than imperial titles, refusing to acknowledge the validity of his coronation, while Carolingian documents began employing imperial protocols that implicitly denied Byzantine claims to universal authority. These symbolic disputes reflected deeper conflicts about territorial control, religious authority, and commercial privileges that affected practical relationships throughout the Mediterranean world. The military implications of the imperial rivalry became apparent through renewed Byzantine efforts to establish their authority in southern Italy, where Carolingian and Byzantine spheres of influence had created an unstable frontier that both empires claimed to control. Byzantine forces operating from their remaining strongholds in Calabria and Sicily launched attacks against Carolingian positions in the Duchy of Benevento, while also attempting to encourage rebellion among Italian populations that had accepted Frankish rule. These military activities represented more than mere territorial disputes. They constituted attempts by each empire to demonstrate the practical effectiveness of its imperial authority through successful military operations against its rival. The ecclesiastical dimensions of the imperial dispute created additional complications that affected religious practices and institutional relationships throughout both empires. The Byzantine Patriarch of Constantinople, who had traditionally maintained ecclesiastical authority over much of southern Italy and the Balkans, found his jurisdiction challenged by papal claims that derived additional force from the Pope's role in creating the new Western Empire. The doctrinal disputes that had previously divided Eastern and Western Christianity, including disagreements about the filioque clause, clerical celibacy, and the use of icons, acquired new political significance as each empire sought to use religious differences to justify its opposition to rival imperial claims. The commercial and economic consequences of the imperial rivalry disrupted established trade patterns throughout the Mediterranean, while creating new opportunities for merchants and communities that could adapt to the changing political landscape. Byzantine efforts to exclude Carolingian merchants from Eastern markets prompted retaliatory measures that affected the flow of luxury goods, spices, and other commodities that had connected Eastern and Western Europe for centuries. The development of alternative trade routes and commercial relationships reflected the broader political realignment that Charles's coronation had initiated, as both empires sought to demonstrate their economic vitality and capacity to provide prosperity for their subjects. The legal and administrative challenges created by imperial dignity required Charles and his advisors to develop new protocols and institutions that could accommodate the expanded responsibilities of ruling an empire rather than merely a kingdom. the Carolingian chancery began producing documents that employed imperial formulas and ceremonial language appropriate to Charles's new status, while court ceremonies incorporated elements derived from both Roman and Germanic traditions. These administrative innovations reflected the practical necessity of governing diverse populations that expected their ruler to demonstrate the dignity and authority appropriate to imperial rank, while also maintaining continuity with established Carolingian practices that had proven effective in managing the kingdom's affairs. The transformation of Charles's court from a peripatetic military headquarters into Europe's most sophisticated centre of learning began with his recognition that imperial authority required intellectual foundations as substantial as its military and administrative apparatus. The establishment of the palace school at Aachen around 782 AD represented a deliberate attempt to create an educational institution that could rival the great centres of learning in Constantinople and Baghdad, while simultaneously providing the trained personnel necessary to govern an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. The school's physical location within the palace complex itself demonstrated Charles's personal commitment to scholarship, as the emperor regularly attended lectures and participated in scholarly discussions, alongside students who ranged from young nobles preparing for administrative careers to mature clerics seeking advanced theological training. The recruitment of Alcuin of York as the school's master in 782 AD marked the decisive moment in the transformation of Carolingian intellectual culture from its Germanic origins toward a sophisticated synthesis of classical learning and Christian scholarship. Alcuin brought with him not only his personal expertise in grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, and theology, but also access to the remarkable library collections that had been preserved in English monasteries since the time of Bede the Venerable. His arrival at Aachen coincided with Charles's growing awareness that effective imperial governance required administrators who could read Latin fluently, compose diplomatic correspondence, maintain accurate records, and navigate the complex legal and theological issues that characterized early medieval statecraft. The Northumbrian scholar's pedagogical methods, refined through decades of teaching at York, provided the systematic approach to education that the Carolingian court had previously lacked. The intellectual community that gathered around Alcuin at the palace school represented an unprecedented concentration of scholarly talent drawn from throughout Western Europe and beyond. Paul the Deacon, the Lombard historian whose knowledge of classical literature and Germanic traditions provided essential bridges between different cultural traditions, contributed his expertise in historical methodology and poetic composition while also serving as a living link to the sophisticated court culture that had flourished in Lombard Italy before the Frankish conquest. Einhard, the diminutive Frankish noble whose architectural interests and administrative capabilities would later make him Charles's most trusted biographer, absorbed classical literary techniques that he would employ to create the first medieval biography that successfully adapted ancient Roman biographical traditions to Christian subject matter. The diversity of the palace school's faculty reflected Charles's understanding that intellectual excellence required exposure to multiple scholarly traditions, rather than narrow adherence to any single approach to learning. Theodulf of Orleans, the Visigothic scholar whose theological sophistication and poetic abilities had attracted imperial attention, brought perspectives shaped by the unique cultural synthesis that had developed in Iberian Christian communities living under Muslim rule. His familiarity with both Latin and Arabic scholarly traditions provided the Carolingian court with insights into Islamic intellectual achievements, while also contributing to theological discussions about the nature of Christian authority in a religiously diverse world. The Irish scholar Dungal, whose mathematical and astronomical knowledge surpassed that of most contemporary European intellectuals, introduced computational techniques and observational methods that enhanced the court's capacity to address practical problems related to calendar reform and architectural planning. The curriculum that emerged at the Palace School reflected Alcuin's systematic approach to education, while accommodating the diverse needs of students who would pursue careers in ecclesiastical, administrative, or military service. The trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic provided the foundation for all advanced study, with particular emphasis on Latin composition and literary analysis that would enable graduates to produce the documents and correspondence necessary for imperial administration. Grammar instruction employed classical texts by authors such as Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero, whose works provided models of literary excellence, while also transmitting knowledge about Roman history, mythology, and political theory that informed Carolingian concepts of imperial authority. The study of rhetoric focused on practical skills necessary for diplomatic negotiations, legal proceedings, and ecclesiastical debates, while dialectical training developed the logical reasoning abilities that students would need to address complex theological and philosophical questions. The quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy represented the mathematical and scientific components of the Palace School curriculum, subjects that had practical applications in architectural projects, military engineering, and ecclesiastical administration. Arithmetic instruction included not only basic computational skills, but also the complex calculations necessary for managing imperial finances, distributing military supplies, and assessing tax obligations throughout the empire's diverse territories. Geometric studies provided the theoretical foundation for the architectural projects that would transform Aachen into a worthy imperial capital, while also contributing to military engineering capabilities that enhanced Carolingian siege warfare techniques. Musical education served both liturgical purposes, as trained singers were essential for proper celebration of Christian worship services and diplomatic functions, since musical performances had become important elements of court ceremonial throughout medieval Europe. The development of Carolingian minuscule represented perhaps the most enduring achievement of the Palace School's scholarly activities, as this revolutionary script would eventually become the foundation for all subsequent European manuscript traditions. The script emerged from systematic efforts by Alcuin and his associates to create a standardized writing system that could be read easily by scholars throughout the Carolingian Empire, regardless of their regional origins or previous training in local scribal traditions. The minuscule's clear letter forms, consistent spacing, and logical abbreviation system represented a dramatic improvement over the various national scripts that had developed throughout early medieval Europe, many of which had become so stylized that they were virtually illegible to anyone outside their regions of origin. The technical innovations incorporated into Carolingian minuscule reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between script design and reading efficiency, as the Palace School scholars recognized that effective communication required writing systems that minimized ambiguity while maximizing legibility. The script's uniform letter heights, standardized spacing between words, and systematic use of punctuation marks created manuscripts that could be read more quickly and accurately than texts produced in earlier scribal traditions. The adoption of minuscule throughout the Carolingian Empire's scriptoria created unprecedented opportunities for scholarly communication, as texts copied in one monastery could be read easily by scholars in distant regions who had been trained in the same writing system. The manuscript production program initiated at Aachen demonstrated Charles's recognition that preserving and disseminating classical and Christian texts required systematic institutional support rather than the haphazard copying efforts that had characterized earlier medieval scholarship. The Palace Scriptorium employed teams of trained scribes who worked under scholarly supervision to produce accurate copies of essential texts, with particular attention to works that provided legal, theological, or historical knowledge necessary for imperial administration. The emphasis on textual accuracy reflected Alcuin's understanding that corrupted manuscripts could transmit errors that would compromise scholarly research and practical decision-making for generations, making careful editorial work as important as skilled penmanship in producing reliable texts. The architectural transformation of Aachen into a worthy imperial capital required the integration of classical Roman building techniques with contemporary engineering innovations and Germanic artistic traditions, creating a unique synthesis that would influence European architecture for centuries. The Palatine Chapel, begun around 786 AD and completed during the first decade of the 9th century, represented the most ambitious architectural project undertaken in Northern Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, demonstrating Charles's determination to create monuments that could rival the great buildings of Constantinople and Rome. The chapel's octagonal design, inspired by the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, incorporated sophisticated engineering solutions that enabled the construction of a substantial dome without the extensive buttressing systems that characterize contemporary Byzantine architecture. The technical challenges involved in constructing the Palatine Chapel required the recruitment of skilled craftsmen and engineers from throughout the known world, as the Carolingian territories lacked the specialized knowledge necessary for such ambitious projects. Master builders from Italy brought expertise in stone cutting and dome construction that had been preserved in regions where Roman building traditions had never entirely disappeared, while Byzantine craftsmen contributed knowledge of mosaic techniques and decorative arts that enhanced the chapel's visual impact. The integration of these diverse technical traditions under Carolingian supervision created new approaches to monumental architecture that combined the structural innovations of Roman engineering with the artistic sensibilities that had developed in post-classical European culture. The chapel's interior decoration program reflected Charles's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between artistic expression and political authority, as the building's visual elements were carefully designed to communicate messages about imperial power and Christian devotion to audiences that included both literate courtiers and illiterate visitors. The mosaic program, executed by craftsmen trained in Byzantine techniques but working under Carolingian direction, incorporated classical and Christian imagery that reinforced themes of imperial legitimacy, while also demonstrating the court's cultural sophistication. The famous mosaic depicting Christ in majesty surrounded by the symbols of the evangelists and attended by angelic figures provided a visual representation of divine authority that validated Charles's imperial claims, while also creating an appropriate setting for the religious ceremonies that legitimized Carolingian rule. The revival of classical architectural forms throughout Charles's building projects extended far beyond the Palatine Chapel to encompass a comprehensive program of construction that transformed the physical landscape of the Carolingian Empire. The palace complex at Aachen included not only religious buildings, but also administrative structures, residential quarters, and recreational facilities that demonstrated the court's commitment to creating an environment worthy of imperial dignity. The Great Hall, constructed using timber frame techniques that incorporated classical proportional systems, provided a setting for court ceremonies and diplomatic receptions that could accommodate hundreds of participants while maintaining the acoustic properties necessary for public speaking and musical performances. The hydraulic engineering projects undertaken at Aachen revealed the extent to which Carolingian builders had mastered Roman technical traditions while adapting them to contemporary needs and local conditions. The construction of thermal baths supplied by natural hot springs and equipped with sophisticated heating and water distribution systems demonstrated both the court's commitment to classical standards of comfort and its technical capacity to execute complex engineering projects. The palace's water supply system, which included aqueducts, cisterns, and drainage networks, provided reliable access to clean water while also supporting the sanitation requirements of a large residential community that included not only the imperial family and court officials, but also the numerous servants, craftsmen, and visitors who contributed to the palace's daily operations. The legal codification efforts that characterized Charles's later reign represented systematic attempts to create unified legal standards that could govern the diverse populations and legal traditions that comprised the Carolingian Empire. The capitularies, issued regularly throughout the emperor's reign, addressed both general principles of governance and specific administrative problems that had emerged as the empire expanded to encompass territories with different legal customs, economic systems, and cultural practices. These legal documents reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between law and political authority, as Charles recognized that effective imperial governance required legal frameworks that commanded respect from subject populations, while also providing practical guidance for administrators who faced complex jurisdictional questions. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 AD established the comprehensive framework for Carolingian legal and administrative reform, addressing issues ranging from ecclesiastical discipline and educational standards to commercial regulations and military obligations. The document's systematic organization and detailed provisions demonstrated the influence of Roman legal traditions on Carolingian jurisprudence, while its emphasis on moral and religious principles reflected the Christian character of the empire's political ideology. The Admonitio's requirements for educational reform, including mandates for the establishment of schools and cathedral and monastic centres throughout the empire, created institutional foundations for the intellectual development that would characterize the Carolingian Renaissance. The Capitular de Vilis, issued around 800 AD, provided detailed regulations for the management of royal estates, while also establishing broader principles for agricultural administration and economic development throughout the empire. The document's comprehensive coverage of topics ranging from crop rotation and livestock management to craft production and market regulations revealed the extent to which imperial administration had penetrated into the daily lives of Carolingian subjects. The Capitulary's emphasis on efficiency, productivity, and systematic record-keeping reflected the influence of classical administrative traditions, while also addressing practical problems that had emerged as the empire's economic complexity increased. The religious uniformity that Charles sought to impose throughout his empire required careful attention to liturgical practices, doctrinal standards, and ecclesiastical organisation that could accommodate regional variations while maintaining essential unity. The standardisation of liturgical books, undertaken through systematic revision of existing texts, and the production of authoritative editions that could be distributed throughout the empire's churches, created unprecedented uniformity in Christian worship practices, while also eliminating regional variations that had sometimes led to theological controversies. The adoption of Roman liturgical traditions as the empire's standard reflected Charles's recognition that religious unity required institutional frameworks that transcended local customs and regional preferences. The ecclesiastical reform program implemented throughout the Carolingian Empire addressed both the practical problems that had emerged from rapid territorial expansion and the theoretical challenges posed by governing religiously diverse populations. The establishment of new bishoprics in recently conquered territories provided institutional frameworks for Christian conversion, while also creating administrative centres that could coordinate secular and religious governance. The requirement that all clergy demonstrate competence in Latin reading and writing ensured that ecclesiastical officials possessed the skills necessary to participate in imperial administration while also maintaining the theological knowledge essential for effective pastoral care. The systematic approach to legal codification that characterised Charles's reign extended beyond specific capitularies to encompass broader efforts at creating comprehensive legal frameworks that could address the complex jurisdictional questions that arose within a multi-ethnic empire. The compilation of existing Frankish legal traditions, combined with selective adoption of Roman legal principles and accommodation of local customs in conquered territories, created legal systems that balanced uniformity with flexibility while maintaining imperial authority over fundamental questions of governance and justice. The training of legal experts who could interpret and apply these complex legal frameworks required educational institutions that could provide both theoretical knowledge and practical experience in legal administration. The transformation from king to emperor demanded administrative innovations that could effectively govern territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River, encompassing populations that spoke different languages, followed distinct legal traditions, and maintained varying degrees of loyalty to Carolingian authority. Charles's solution to this unprecedented challenge emerged through the systematic expansion of the Missi Dominici system, an institution that had existed in rudimentary form during his father's reign, but required complete reconceptualization to meet the demands of imperial administration. These royal envoys, travelling in pairs that typically consisted of one ecclesiastical and one secular official, became the emperor's eyes and ears throughout his vast domains, conducting regular inspections that ensured local administrators remained accountable to central authority while also providing channels for communication between distant provinces and the imperial court. The Missi Dominici operated according to carefully structured protocols that balanced respect for local customs with enforcement of imperial directives, requiring diplomatic skills as sophisticated as their administrative capabilities. Each pair of envoys received detailed written instructions known as capitula that specified their responsibilities during particular missions and provided guidance for addressing common problems they might encounter in their assigned territories. These instructions covered an enormous range of issues, from investigating complaints about corrupt officials and ensuring proper collection of taxes to verifying that churches maintained adequate educational programs and that military obligations were being fulfilled according to imperial requirements. The systematic nature of these directives reflected Charles's recognition that effective governance required consistent standards applied uniformly throughout the empire, regardless of regional variations in local practices. The territorial organisation that supported the Missi Dominici system divided the empire into circuits, or missatica, that typically encompassed several counties and were designed to be traversed completely during a single inspection tour lasting several months. The boundaries of these circuits reflected careful consideration of geographic factors, transportation networks, and political relationships that could facilitate or impede the envoy's work. The Alpine regions, with their difficult terrain and scattered populations, required different approaches than the densely settled river valleys of Francia, while recently conquered territories like Saxony and the Ostmark demanded more frequent visits and greater attention to potential signs of rebellion or resistance to imperial authority. The selection criteria for Missi Dominici emphasized personal loyalty to Charles, demonstrated administrative competence, and the social status necessary to command respect from local nobles and ecclesiastical officials who might otherwise resist external oversight. Ecclesiastical envoys were typically drawn from the ranks of bishops or prominent abbots, whose theological training and institutional authority enabled them to address religious questions, while their secular counterparts usually held comital rank or equivalent status within the imperial hierarchy. This careful attention to social precedents reflected the realities of early medieval politics, where effective authority depended as much on personal relationships and recognized status as on official appointment and written credentials. The practical challenges faced by Missi Dominici during their inspection tours revealed the enormous complexity of governing an empire that encompassed such diverse populations and territories. In newly conquered Saxon regions, envoys needed to assess the sincerity of Christian conversions, while also investigating reports of continued pagan practices that violated imperial law. The Slavic territories beyond the Danube presented different challenges, as local leaders who had submitted to Carolingian authority maintained traditional governance structures that sometimes conflicted with Frankish administrative practices. The envoy's reports, preserved in a fragmentary form in various archives, provide detailed glimpses of local conditions and the persistent problems that challenged imperial administration throughout Charles's reign. The economic policies that Charles implemented to support his expanded empire required sophisticated understanding of the relationship between monetary systems, trade networks, and political authority that reflected both classical Roman precedents and contemporary commercial realities. The monetary reform initiated around 793. 794 AD established new standards for silver coinage that created the foundation for economic transactions throughout Carolingian territories, while also providing the emperor with additional sources of revenue through minting privileges and currency exchange requirements. The new denarius, weighing approximately 1.7 grams of silver and bearing Charles's imperial titles and Christian symbols, became the standard medium of exchange throughout the empire and established precedents that would influence European monetary systems for centuries. The standardization of weights and measures throughout the Carolingian Empire addressed practical problems that had hindered commercial development, while also demonstrating imperial authority over the most basic aspects of economic life. The diversity of measurement systems that had characterized early medieval Europe created enormous complications. For merchants who needed to conduct business across regional boundaries, as the same nominal quantities could represent significantly different actual amounts depending on local standards. Charles's solution involved the systematic establishment of standard measures that were maintained at designated locations throughout the empire, with local officials responsible for ensuring that merchants and craftsmen employed accurate weights and measures in their commercial activities. The Capitula de Vilis demonstrated the emperor's detailed attention to agricultural administration and economic development through its comprehensive regulations governing the management of royal estates. These extensive properties, scattered throughout the empire and managed by appointed stewards, served multiple functions within the Carolingian economic system. They provided direct revenues for imperial administration, served as models for agricultural innovation and productivity improvements, and created employment opportunities for populations in regions where alternative economic activities were limited. The Capitulary's detailed specifications for crop rotation, livestock management, and craft production revealed the sophisticated understanding of agricultural science that characterized Carolingian administration, while its emphasis on systematic record-keeping reflected the influence of Roman administrative traditions on imperial governance. The regulation of markets and commercial activities required careful balance between encouraging economic development and maintaining imperial control over activities that could affect political stability or military security. The establishment of designated market towns, each authorized to conduct commercial activities on specific days and under defined conditions, created controlled environments where imperial officials could monitor trade activities while also providing convenient locations for merchants to conduct business. These market privileges became valuable sources of revenue for the imperial treasury, as towns competed for the right to hold markets and were willing to pay substantial fees for commercial privileges that could enhance their economic prosperity. The monetary policies implemented throughout Charles's reign reflected his understanding that effective imperial authority required stable currency systems that could facilitate commercial transactions while also providing reliable sources of government revenue. The prohibition against private minting of coins eliminated the confusion created by multiple currency systems, while also ensuring that all legal tender bore imperial symbols and inscriptions that reinforced political authority. The requirement that certain types of transactions be conducted using imperial currency, rather than barter arrangements, created demand for official coinage, while also providing imperial administrators with better information about economic activities throughout their territories. The religious reforms that characterized Charles's imperial administration reflected his conviction that political unity required spiritual uniformity. though the practical implementation of this principle required careful attention to regional variations and local sensibilities that could not be eliminated through imperial decree alone. The systematic revision of liturgical texts, undertaken by teams of scholars working under imperial supervision, created standardized versions of essential religious documents that could be distributed throughout the empire's churches and monasteries. These efforts built upon the earlier work of the palace school, while extending its influence far beyond the imperial court to encompass ecclesiastical institutions throughout Carolingian territories. The educational requirements imposed on clergy throughout the empire represented perhaps the most systematic attempt at intellectual reform undertaken during the early medieval period, as Charles recognised that effective religious leadership required educational foundations that many contemporary clerics lacked. The mandate that all priests demonstrate competence in Latin reading and writing, along with basic knowledge of Christian doctrine and liturgical practices, created enormous challenges for ecclesiastical institutions that had previously operated with minimal educational standards. The establishment of cathedral schools and the expansion of existing monastic educational programs provided institutional frameworks for meeting these new requirements, though the implementation process required decades of sustained effort and substantial financial investment. The standardization of liturgical practices throughout the Carolingian Empire involved far more than simply distributing corrected texts, as it required systematic training of clergy in proper ceremonial procedures and musical traditions that had developed differently in various regions. The adoption of Roman liturgical traditions as the imperial standard reflected Charles's political alliance with the papacy, while also providing practical advantages through the elimination of regional variations that had sometimes caused confusion or controversy. The Gregorian chant traditions that became standard throughout Carolingian territories required specialized musical training that necessitated the development of new educational programs and the recruitment of skilled instructors who could transmit complex musical knowledge to local clergy. The regulation of monastic life throughout the empire addressed both spiritual concerns about maintaining proper religious observance and practical considerations about the economic and political roles that monasteries played within Carolingian society. The systematic implementation of the rule of St. Benedict, promoted through imperial legislation and enforced through regular inspections, created unprecedented uniformity in monastic practices, while also establishing clear standards for evaluating the performance of individual institutions. The economic regulations that governed monastic properties reflected the emperor's recognition that these institutions controlled substantial resources that needed to be managed efficiently to support both religious activities and broader social functions. The Divisio Regnorum of 806 AD represented Charles's most systematic attempt to address the fundamental tension between imperial unity and Frankish inheritance traditions that threatened to fragment his carefully constructed political system after his death. The documents detailed provisions for dividing the empire among his 3 surviving sons, reflected both his desire to preserve Carolingian authority and his recognition that traditional Frankish customs required some accommodation of hereditary principles that could not be entirely superseded by imperial innovations. The territorial arrangements specified in the Divisio attempted to create viable kingdoms for each heir, while maintaining coordination mechanisms that could preserve essential unity in military and diplomatic affairs. The specific territorial divisions outlined in the Divisio Regnorum revealed Charles's sophisticated understanding of the geographic, economic, and strategic factors that determined the viability of different regions as independent political units. Charles the Younger received the Western territories, including Neustria, Burgundy, and portions of Aquitaine, regions that formed a coherent geographic unit with established administrative systems and reliable sources of revenue. Pepin received the Italian kingdom along with Bavaria and portions of Alemannia, creating a realm that combined the wealthy Italian cities with the strategic Alpine passes and Danubian frontier regions. Louis received Aquitaine and the Spanish March, territories that required continued military attention, but also offered opportunities for expansion and the development of distinctive political traditions. The coordination mechanisms established by the Divisio Regnorum addressed the practical challenges of maintaining cooperation among independent rulers who would inevitably develop competing interests and conflicting priorities. The document specified procedures for resolving disputes between the kingdoms, including requirements for consultation on major diplomatic initiatives and coordination of military responses to external threats. The provisions governing ecclesiastical affairs emphasized the importance of maintaining religious unity, even if political fragmentation became unavoidable, reflecting Charles's recognition that the Church provided the most reliable institutional framework for preserving Carolingian cultural and political traditions. The succession crisis that emerged following the deaths of Charles the Younger in 811 AD and Pepin of Italy in 810 AD fundamentally altered the political calculations that had informed the original Divisio Regnorum, leaving Louis as the sole surviving heir and creating opportunities for political reunification that Charles had not originally anticipated. The emperor's decision to crown Louis as co-emperor in 813 AD represented both recognition of changed circumstances and his continued commitment to preserving imperial dignity through legitimate succession procedures. The ceremony at Aachen, conducted without papal participation, demonstrated Charles's assertion of imperial authority over succession questions, while also providing Louis with the legitimacy necessary to maintain political stability during the transition period. The administrative innovations that characterized Charles's final years reflected his growing awareness that imperial governance required institutional frameworks that could function effectively regardless of the personal capabilities or preferences of individual rulers. The systematic codification of administrative procedures, the establishment of permanent record-keeping systems, and the creation of training programs for imperial officials represented attempts to institutionalize the governmental practices that had emerged through decades of practical experience. These reforms addressed the fundamental challenge of early medieval governance, creating political systems that could maintain effectiveness and legitimacy across generational transitions in societies where personal relationships and individual charisma played decisive roles in political authority. The financial administration that supported Charles's imperial government required unprecedented sophistication in revenue collection, expenditure planning, and resource allocation across territories that employed different economic systems and faced varying levels of external pressure. The systematic assessment of tax obligations throughout the empire involved complex calculations that considered local economic conditions, military requirements, and political sensitivities that could affect the stability of imperial authority in different regions. The development of standardized accounting procedures and the training of financial administrators capable of managing these complex systems represented significant innovations in medieval governmental practice that would influence European administrative development for centuries. The military reforms implemented during Charles's imperial period addressed both the immediate challenges of defending expanded frontiers and the long-term requirements for maintaining professional military capabilities that could respond effectively to diverse types of threats. The systematization of military obligations throughout the empire created more reliable mechanisms for raising armies, while also ensuring that the burden of military service was distributed equitably among different social groups and geographic regions. The establishment of permanent garrisons in frontier regions provided immediate defensive capabilities while also creating institutional frameworks for military training and the development of specialized skills necessary for particular types of warfare. The systematic brutality that characterized the final phase of the Saxon Wars reflected Charles's determination to end 3 decades of intermittent rebellion through measures so severe that future resistance would become unthinkable. The mass deportations that began in earnest after 804 AD represented the culmination of increasingly harsh policies designed to break the cultural and territorial foundations of Saxon identity. Unlike the earlier forced conversions and executions that had targeted specific acts of rebellion, these deportations aimed at the wholesale restructuring of Saxon society through the physical removal of entire populations from their ancestral lands. Contemporary Frankish chroniclers recorded the relocation of approximately 10,000 Saxon families from their traditional territories along the Elbe River to scattered settlements throughout the Carolingian and heartlands, where they would be surrounded by Christian populations and subjected to intensive supervision by Frankish administrators. The logistics of these mass relocations revealed the sophisticated administrative capabilities that the Carolingian state had developed through decades of military campaigning and territorial expansion. Imperial officials organised the deportations with methodical precision, conducting detailed censuses of Saxon households to determine which families possessed the skills, livestock, and portable wealth that would make them valuable additions to Frankish communities. The selection process favoured younger families with children who could be more easily assimilated into Christian culture, while older Saxons who maintained strong attachments to traditional religious practices faced harsher treatment, including enslavement or execution for those who refused to abandon pagan customs entirely. The transportation of thousands of Saxon deportees across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain required extensive coordination between military units responsible for security and civilian administrators who managed the practical aspects of moving large populations with their possessions and livestock. Frankish quartermasters established supply depots along the designated routes, while also negotiating with local communities that would provide temporary shelter and provisions during the journey. The deportation columns, stretching for miles and moving at the pace of heavily loaded ox carts, presented vulnerable targets for Saxon raiders who attempted to rescue their kinsmen or inflict casualties on their Frankish captors. The distribution of Saxon families throughout Frankish territories followed carefully planned patterns designed to prevent the formation of concentrated Saxon communities that might maintain their traditional culture or organise resistance activities. Imperial administrators scattered the deportees across multiple counties, typically settling small groups of families in established Frankish villages where they would be outnumbered by the local population and subjected to constant observation. The Saxon settlers received land grants that provided sufficient resources for survival, but remained dependent on Frankish neighbours for access to markets, craft services, and other necessities that required integration into existing economic networks. The cultural impact of these deportations extended far beyond their immediate demographic effects, as the removal of entire communities from their ancestral territories severed the connections between Saxon populations and the sacred sites, burial grounds, and natural landmarks that had anchored their religious and social traditions for centuries. The destruction of Saxon religious centres, including the systematic elimination of sacred groves, stone circles, and other sites associated with traditional worship practices, completed the cultural devastation that the deportations had initiated. Frankish clergy accompanied the deportation columns to ensure that Saxon families received Christian instruction during their journey and to identify individuals who might require additional supervision due to persistent attachment to pagan beliefs. The establishment of the Danish March represented Charles's recognition that the elimination of Saxon resistance had created new strategic vulnerabilities along the empire's northern frontier, where Danish kingdom viewed Carolingian expansion with growing alarm. The Danish king Godfred had observed the systematic destruction of Saxon independence with obvious concern about the implications for his own territories, as Frankish control over the entire southern shore of the Baltic Sea created unprecedented pressure on Danish trade routes and territorial security. The construction of the Dannevirke, a massive earthwork fortification system that stretched across the base of the Jutland Peninsula, demonstrated Danish determination to resist Carolingian expansion while also revealing their sophisticated understanding of the military engineering techniques that had proven so effective in Frankish campaigns. The appointment of competent margraves to govern the Danish frontier reflected Charles's understanding that this region would require administrators who combined military experience with diplomatic skills, as the Danish kingdoms possessed naval capabilities that could threaten Carolingian coastal territories and trade networks. The margrave's responsibilities included not only the traditional functions of frontier defence, but also the complex task of managing relationships with Danish merchants, diplomats, and refugees who crossed the border for various purposes. The establishment of fortified positions at strategic locations along the frontier provided secure bases for Carolingian patrols, while also serving as centres for the collection of intelligence about Danish military preparations and political developments. The construction of border fortifications along the Danish March required innovative engineering solutions that adapted traditional Carolingian fortress design to the unique geographic and strategic challenges posed by the northern frontier. The marshy terrain that characterized much of the border region made conventional stone construction impractical, forcing Frankish engineers to develop earthwork and timber fortifications that could provide effective defence while remaining stable in the waterlogged soil. The fortress systems incorporated sophisticated drainage networks that prevented flooding while also creating obstacles that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where Carolingian defenders could inflict maximum casualties. The economic development of the Danish March created new opportunities for trade and settlement, while also generating revenues that helped offset the substantial costs of frontier administration and defence. The region's access to Baltic trade networks provided Carolingian merchants with opportunities to acquire amber, furs, and other northern products that commanded high prices in southern markets, while Danish traders sought Frankish manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items that demonstrated their wealth and status. The establishment of designated trading centres at strategic locations along the frontier enabled imperial officials to monitor commercial activities while also collecting customs duties that contributed to the March's financial self-sufficiency. The death of Charles the Younger in December 811 AD eliminated the heir who had been designated to inherit the western portions of the empire according to the provisions of the Divisio Regnorum, creating a succession crisis that threatened to destabilise the carefully planned arrangements for imperial continuity. The young king's death, apparently from illness while campaigning against Slavic tribes beyond the Elbe, represented not only a personal loss for Charles, but also a political catastrophe that required immediate attention to prevent the emergence of competing claims to his territories. The speed with which news of his son's death reached the imperial court at Aachen demonstrated the efficiency of the communication networks that had been established throughout the empire, as mounted messengers carried the devastating information across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. The death of Pepin of Italy in July 810 AD had already complicated the succession arrangements outlined in the Divisio Regnorum, as his young son Bernard's claim to the Italian kingdom created potential conflicts with the territorial redistributions that might become necessary following Charles the Younger's death. The concentration of the entire imperial inheritance in the hands of Louis the Pious represented both an opportunity for maintaining imperial unity and a challenge to traditional Frankish inheritance practices that had historically required the division of royal patrimony among legitimate male heirs. Charles's decision to proceed with Louis's coronation as co-emperor reflected his recognition that imperial dignity required different succession procedures than those that had governed traditional Frankish kingdoms. The implications of concentrating the entire Carolingian inheritance in Louis's hands extended far beyond immediate succession questions to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of imperial authority and its relationship to traditional Germanic kingship. The empire that Louis would inherit differed dramatically from the collection of Frankish territories that Charles had received from his father, as decades of conquest and administrative innovation had created political institutions and cultural expectations that transcended the boundaries of any single ethnic or regional identity. The challenge facing the future emperor involved maintaining the delicate balance between imperial unity and regional autonomy that had enabled Charles to govern such diverse territories effectively, while also addressing the new problems that would inevitably emerge as the empire matured. The Treaty of Aachen, negotiated with Byzantine representatives in 812 AD, represented the culmination of more than a decade of diplomatic efforts to resolve the two emperors problem that had complicated relations between the Carolingian and Byzantine empires since Charles's coronation in 800 AD. The agreement's recognition of Charles's imperial title in exchange for Carolingian acknowledgement of Byzantine sovereignty over southern Italy and Sicily created a practical solution to territorial disputes that had generated intermittent warfare throughout the Mediterranean region. The treaty's careful language avoided explicit statements about the theoretical basis of imperial authority, while establishing practical arrangements that both empires could accept without compromising their fundamental political principles. The negotiations that produced the Treaty of Aachen required sophisticated diplomatic skills from representatives who needed to navigate the complex theological, legal, and political issues that had divided the two empires for more than a century. The Carolingian delegation included both secular officials with extensive experience in international diplomacy and ecclesiastical representatives who could address the religious dimensions of imperial authority that had complicated previous negotiations. The Byzantine envoys brought with them detailed knowledge of Eastern political traditions and legal precedents that needed to be accommodated within any agreement that would prove acceptable to the imperial court at Constantinople. The territorial provisions of the Treaty of Aachen reflected the military and political realities that had emerged from years of intermittent conflict between Carolingian and Byzantine forces in southern Italy, where neither empire possessed sufficient resources to achieve decisive victory over its rival. The agreement's recognition of Byzantine control over Calabria and Sicily acknowledged the effectiveness of Eastern naval power in maintaining communications and supply lines with Constantinople, while Carolingian retention of most mainland Italian territories reflected the superior land-based military capabilities that had enabled Frankish forces to dominate most contested regions. The establishment of clear territorial boundaries eliminated the ambiguities that had provided pretext for continued military operations, while creating frameworks for commercial and diplomatic relationships that could benefit both empires. The commercial provisions of the treaty addressed practical issues that had affected trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean region, as the political rivalry between the two empires had disrupted established commercial networks while creating opportunities for pirates and other criminal elements to exploit the confusion generated by competing jurisdictions. The agreement established procedures for resolving disputes involving merchants from both empires, while also creating mechanisms for coordinating anti-piracy operations that required cooperation between Carolingian and Byzantine naval forces. The restoration of normal commercial relationships provided immediate economic benefits for both empires, while also creating constituencies that had vested interests in maintaining peaceful relations. The ecclesiastical dimensions of the Treaty of Aachen addressed some of the religious issues that had complicated relations between Eastern and Western Christianity, though the agreement avoided direct confrontation with the most contentious theological disputes that divided the two churches. The treaty's provisions regarding ecclesiastical jurisdiction in southern Italy created practical arrangements for pastoral care and administrative oversight that accommodated both Roman and Constantinopolitan claims to authority over disputed territories. The agreement's careful silence on doctrinal issues, such as the filioque controversy and iconoclasm, reflected the negotiators' recognition that theological disputes required different approaches than the territorial and political questions that the treaty addressed directly. The diplomatic achievements represented by the Treaty of Aachen extended beyond its immediate provisions to establish precedents for international relations that would influence European political development for centuries. The agreement demonstrated that even the most fundamental political disputes could be resolved through systematic negotiation when both parties recognised the costs of continued conflict and possessed sufficient flexibility to accommodate competing interests. The treaty's success in creating stable boundaries and practical cooperation mechanisms provided a model for subsequent diplomatic efforts to address territorial disputes and jurisdictional conflicts throughout medieval Europe. The personal toll that decades of continuous warfare and administrative responsibility had taken on Charles became increasingly apparent during his final years, as contemporary sources describe an emperor whose physical vigour had declined markedly since his coronation. The rigorous travel schedule that had characterised his earlier reign, when he personally led military campaigns and conducted regular tours of inspection throughout his territories, gave way to longer periods of residence at Aachen, where he could manage imperial affairs from the comfort and security of his palace complex. The emperor's increasing reliance on written reports rather than personal observation reflected both his physical limitations and the administrative sophistication that enabled effective governance through institutional mechanisms rather than purely personal leadership. The architectural projects that occupied much of Charles's attention during his final years reflected his desire to create lasting monuments that would preserve his memory while also providing practical facilities that would serve the needs of future emperors. The completion of the Palatine Chapel represented the culmination of more than 2 decades of construction work that had transformed Aachen from a modest royal estate into a worthy imperial capital. The chapel's sophisticated design and rich decoration demonstrated the artistic and technical achievements that characterised the Carolingian Renaissance, while also providing an appropriate setting for the religious ceremonies that legitimised imperial authority. The educational and cultural programmes that had flourished under Charles's patronage continued to produce scholars, administrators, and clergy whose training enabled them to serve effectively throughout the empire's diverse territories. The palace school's graduates occupied important positions in cathedral chapters, monastic communities, and secular administration, creating networks of educated officials who shared common intellectual foundations and cultural values that transcended regional boundaries. The systematic copying and distribution of classical and Christian texts had created library collections throughout the empire that preserved essential knowledge while also providing resources for continued intellectual development. The legal and administrative innovations that had emerged through decades of practical experience in governing diverse populations created institutional frameworks that would survive the political fragmentation that followed Charles's death. The capitulary system had established precedents for systematic legislation that addressed both general principles and specific problems, while the Missi Dominici had demonstrated the effectiveness of regular inspection and oversight in maintaining imperial authority across vast distances. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency had created economic foundations that facilitated commercial development while also providing reliable sources of government revenue. The military reforms that had enabled Carolingian forces to achieve unprecedented success against diverse enemies had created professional capabilities that would influence European warfare for centuries. The integration of heavy cavalry with infantry and siege equipment had proven effective against opponents ranging from Saxon tribal warriors to Byzantine professional soldiers, while the systematic approach to fortification construction had created defensive networks that protected conquered territories against counterattack. The development of logistical systems capable of supporting extended campaigns in distant territories had enabled the empire to project power far beyond its traditional boundaries while maintaining the supply lines necessary for sustained military operations. The emperor's final years unfolded against the backdrop of an empire that had achieved unprecedented stability and territorial extent, yet faced mounting challenges that would test the institutional foundations Charles had spent decades constructing. By 812 AD, the physical demands of governing territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube had begun to take their toll on a ruler who had personally led military campaigns across 3 decades of continuous expansion. Contemporary observers noted that Charles, now in his mid-60s, moved with increasing difficulty and relied more heavily on his advisors for the detailed administrative work that had once commanded his personal attention. The emperor's legendary appetite, which had sustained him through countless military campaigns, began to diminish as he suffered from recurring fevers and digestive ailments that confined him to Aachen for increasingly extended periods. The harsh winter of 813-814 AD proved particularly challenging for Charles's declining health, as the damp cold that penetrated even the well-heated chambers of the Palatine Chapel aggravated respiratory problems that had troubled him intermittently for several years. Einhard's detailed account, compiled from first-hand observation and court records, describes an emperor who continued to conduct essential business from his bed when standing became too difficult, dictating correspondence and receiving reports from throughout his domains, while struggling with the physical weakness that made even basic tasks exhausting. The emperor's determination to maintain his governmental responsibilities despite obvious suffering impressed courtiers who had grown accustomed to his seemingly inexhaustible energy and commanding physical presence. The final illness that would claim Charles's life began in January 814 AD, with what contemporary sources described as a sharp pain in his side, accompanied by a high fever that left him delirious for extended periods. The palace physicians, drawing upon the limited medical knowledge available in early 9th century Europe, attempted various treatments including bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers for divine intervention, but their efforts proved inadequate against what modern medical analysis suggests was likely pneumonia, complicated by other age-related ailments. The emperor's condition deteriorated rapidly over the course of several days, during which he alternated between periods of lucidity, when he could recognize visitors and give simple instructions, and episodes of fevered unconsciousness that alarmed his attendants. The court's preparation for Charles's death revealed the sophisticated protocols that had evolved around imperial dignity during his reign, as palace officials balanced their genuine grief with the practical necessities of ensuring governmental continuity during the transition period. The emperor's final coherent acts included receiving the last rites from Archbishop Hildebald of Cologne, and making provisions for the distribution of his personal treasure among various religious institutions and loyal retainers. Contemporary accounts describe Charles's peaceful death on January 28, 814 AD, shortly after dawn, surrounded by his closest advisors and family members who had maintained vigil throughout his final night. The immediate response to Charles's death demonstrated both the genuine affection he'd inspired among his subjects and the political sophistication of the administrative system he'd created. News of the emperor's passing spread rapidly throughout the empire via the messenger networks that had been established for governmental communication, reaching distant frontiers within weeks despite the winter weather that complicated travel. Local officials throughout the empire conducted memorial services that combined Christian prayers for the deceased emperor's soul with secular ceremonies that honoured his achievements and affirmed loyalty to his successor. The absence of any significant rebellions or political disturbances following Charles's death testified to the stability of the institutional frameworks he had established and the general acceptance of Louis the Pious as his legitimate heir. The funeral arrangements for Charles reflected the unique synthesis of Christian and imperial traditions that had characterized his reign, as court officials drew upon both Roman precedents for honouring deceased emperors and Germanic customs for commemorating fallen war leaders. The emperor's body, dressed in imperial regalia and surrounded by symbols of his earthly achievements, lay in state within the Palatine Chapel for several days while subjects from throughout the region came to pay their respects. The funeral procession that accompanied Charles to his final resting place included representatives from every major institution within the empire, bishops and abbots carrying religious relics, secular nobles bearing the symbols of their offices, and military commanders representing the armies that had achieved his territorial conquests. The burial itself took place within the Palatine Chapel, where Charles was interred in a marble sarcophagus that had been prepared during his lifetime according to his specific instructions. The location reflected his desire to remain connected to the religious and political centre he had created at Aachen, while the simplicity of the burial arrangements demonstrated his recognition that earthly glory was temporary compared to the spiritual rewards that awaited faithful Christians. The tomb's inscription, composed in elegant Latin verse that celebrated both his imperial achievements and his Christian devotion, provided future generations with a concise summary of how Charles wished to be remembered by posterity. Louis the Pious assumed imperial authority with remarkable smoothness, benefiting from the careful preparation his father had provided through the co-emperorship established in 813 AD and the administrative experience he'd gained through decades of governing Aquitaine as a sub-kingdom. The new emperor's first actions demonstrated both continuity with his father's policies and recognition of the new challenges that would face the empire in the post-Charlemagne era. Louis retained most of his father's key advisors while also promoting younger officials who brought fresh perspectives to imperial administration, creating a balance between institutional memory and innovative approaches to governance that helped maintain stability during the crucial transition period. The territorial integrity that Charles had achieved through military conquest and diplomatic negotiation remained intact during the immediate aftermath of his death, though subtle signs of future fragmentation began to appear as regional nobles tested the new emperor's resolve and commitment to maintaining centralized authority. The Danish frontier, where King Godfred's successors continued to probe Carolingian defences, required immediate attention from Louis's military commanders, who lacked Charles's personal reputation for invincibility in battle. The Slavic territories beyond the Elbe, held through a combination of military intimidation and diplomatic accommodation, showed early signs of restiveness, as local leaders calculated whether the new emperor possessed his father's determination to maintain imperial authority through force when necessary. The ecclesiastical establishment throughout the empire provided crucial support for Louis's succession, as bishops and abbots who had benefited from Charles's generous patronage and religious reforms recognized that their own interests depended on maintaining the political stability that had enabled the Carolingian Renaissance to flourish. The systematic approach to religious education and liturgical standardization that had characterized Charles's reign created institutional frameworks that transcended individual personalities, enabling the Church to serve as a stabilizing force during periods of political uncertainty. The monastic communities that had received imperial protection and financial support became centers of loyalty to Carolingian authority, while also preserving the intellectual and cultural achievements that represented Charles's most enduring legacy. The economic foundations that had supported Charles's military campaigns and administrative expansion provided Louis with substantial resources for maintaining imperial authority, though the costs of governing such vast territories continued to strain available revenues. The standardized currency system that had facilitated commercial development throughout the empire generated reliable income through minting privileges and customs duties, while the systematic approach to agricultural management on royal estates provided both direct revenues and models for productivity improvements that benefited the broader economy. The trade networks that connected Carolingian territories with Byzantine, Islamic, and Northern European markets created commercial relationships that had developed their own momentum and continued to function regardless of political changes at the imperial level. The transformation of Charles from historical figure to legendary hero began almost immediately after his death, as chroniclers and poets throughout Europe began crafting narratives that emphasized his most dramatic achievements while minimizing or ignoring his failures and limitations. The process of legendary creation reflected both genuine admiration for his accomplishments and the political needs of his successors, who benefited from association with an idealized version of Carolingian greatness that could legitimize their own authority and inspire loyalty among their subjects. The historical Charles, who had struggled with practical problems of governance and made strategic miscalculations that sometimes resulted in military disasters, gradually gave way to a mythical figure whose wisdom, courage, and Christian devotion became models for subsequent medieval rulers. The earliest biographical treatments of Charles, particularly Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, established literary and historical precedents that would influence European historical writing for centuries. Einhard's work, modelled on Suetonius's biographies of Roman emperors but adapted to Christian sensibilities and medieval political realities, presented Charles as the ideal Christian ruler, whose personal virtues and political achievements demonstrated divine favour and provided lessons for future generations. The biography's careful balance between factual accuracy and moral instruction created a template for medieval historical writing that emphasised the exemplary aspects of great rulers while providing practical guidance for their successors. The monastic chroniclers who recorded Charles's reign for posterity brought different perspectives and priorities to their historical accounts, emphasising the religious dimensions of his achievements, while also preserving detailed information about political and military events that might otherwise have been lost. The Royal Frankish Annals, compiled at various monastic centres throughout the empire, provided year-by-year accounts of major events that created comprehensive records of Carolingian political development. These chronicles, written by authors who had access to official documents and eyewitness accounts, preserved essential information about administrative innovations, diplomatic negotiations, and military campaigns that enabled later historians to reconstruct the practical mechanisms of Carolingian governance. The literary transformation of Charles's military campaigns into epic narratives began during his lifetime, but achieved its most influential form in the Chanson de Roland, which converted the historical disaster at Roncevaux into a tale of heroic sacrifice that embodied medieval ideals of Christian knighthood and feudal loyalty. The process by which actual events became legendary narratives revealed the complex relationship between historical memory and cultural values in medieval society, as poets and chroniclers adapted factual material to serve contemporary political and spiritual needs. The substitution of Muslim enemies for the Basque attackers who had actually ambushed Charles's rearguard reflected both the religious prejudices of later medieval audiences and the utility of portraying Carolingian defeats as part of the broader Christian struggle against Islamic expansion. The educational and cultural achievements of Charles's reign provided foundations for intellectual development that would influence European civilization long after the political unity of his empire had dissolved. The palace school's systematic approach to classical education created generations of scholars who preserved and transmitted ancient learning while also developing new approaches to theology, law, and natural philosophy that advanced medieval intellectual culture. The standardization of Latin writing through Carolingian minuscule enabled scholarly communication across linguistic and political boundaries, creating the foundation for the international intellectual community that would characterize medieval European scholarship. The legal innovations that emerged from Charles's efforts to govern diverse populations created precedents and institutional frameworks that would influence European legal development for centuries. The capitulary system demonstrated the possibility of systematic legislation that could address both general principles and specific administrative problems, while the integration of Roman, Germanic, and canonical legal traditions created synthetic approaches to jurisprudence that accommodated diverse cultural backgrounds within unified political systems. The training of legal experts who could interpret and apply these complex legal frameworks establish professional traditions that would eventually contribute to the development of medieval universities and the systematic study of law as an academic discipline. The long-term consequences of Carolingian rule extended far beyond the immediate territorial boundaries of Charles's empire to influence the fundamental development of European political, religious and cultural institutions. The concept of Christian empire that Charles embodied provided ideological foundations for the Holy Roman Empire that would dominate Central European politics for nearly 1,000 years, while his alliance with the papacy established precedents for the complex relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that would shape medieval political theory. The administrative innovations developed to govern his diverse territories created institutional models that would be adapted and refined by subsequent medieval rulers throughout Europe. The feudal relationships that emerged from Charles's need to delegate authority over distant territories while maintaining imperial unity created social and political structures that would characterize European society throughout the medieval period. The systematic granting of land in exchange for military service and administrative responsibilities established contractual relationships between rulers and nobles that provided frameworks for political organization when centralized authority proved inadequate for governing large territories. The integration of military, administrative and social functions within feudal relationships created flexible systems that could adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining essential continuity in local governance. The concept of European unity that Charles's empire represented, however briefly, provided inspiration for subsequent attempts to create political frameworks that could transcend the tribal and regional divisions that had characterized post-Roman Europe. The practical demonstration that diverse populations could be governed effectively under unified authority, while maintaining their distinctive cultural traditions, offered precedents for later efforts to balance unity with diversity in European political development. The Carolingian synthesis of Roman administrative techniques, Germanic legal traditions, and Christian moral principles created cultural foundations that would influence European identity formation throughout the medieval period and beyond. The death of Charlemagne marked not merely the end of an individual life, but the conclusion of a transformative era that had reshaped the political, cultural, and religious landscape of Western Europe. His empire, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube and from the North Sea to central Italy, represented the most successful attempt to restore unified authority over former Roman territories since the fall of the Western Empire more than 3 centuries earlier. Though political fragmentation would soon divide his territorial conquests among competing heirs, the institutional innovations, cultural achievements, and conceptual frameworks he had established would provide enduring foundations for European civilization. The legend of Charlemagne, carefully cultivated by medieval chroniclers and poets, would inspire countless subsequent rulers who sought to emulate his synthesis of military prowess, administrative skill, and Christian devotion. In death, as in life, Charles remained a towering figure whose achievements and failures alike would continue to influence European political development for generations to come, earning him recognition as one of history's most consequential rulers and the true father of medieval European civilization.